The roar of engines thundered across the clouds as the German Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers, determined to crush the island nation before invasion. Against them stood a vastly outnumbered band of Royal Air Force pilots, young men barely out of school, flying outdated planes, yet bound by duty to defend their homeland. Across the countryside, families huddled in shelters as bombs lit the night sky, cities burned and sirens wailed in endless alarm. Every dogfight, every contrail scratched across the heavens, carried the weight of freedom itself, for if Britain fell, the world would face a darkness from which there might be no return. Yet, through courage, sacrifice, and sheer resilience, a legend was born, the few who stood between tyranny and liberty. This is the entire story of the Battle of Britain, the strategy, the sacrifice, the terror and the triumph that shaped the course of World War II. So close your eyes, let the sounds of history surround you, and allow this documentary to carry you through the clouds of battle as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there, because together across skies and generations, we keep this history alive. In the summer of 1940, Europe seemed to tremble under the boots of Adolf Hitler's armies, for France, once considered the greatest land power on the continent, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. The German Blitzkrieg, a terrifying fusion of tanks, mechanized infantry, and relentless air power, cut through the French defenses with surgical precision. Where World War I had seen years of stalemate across trenches, this new war unfolded with shocking speed and devastating impact. The French armies, unprepared for such mobile warfare, found themselves outflanked and encircled, their morale breaking under the weight of relentless attacks. German panzers rolled across the Ardennes, a region the French High Command had considered impassable, striking where they were least expected. The vaunted Maginot Line, a massive chain of fortifications, was simply bypassed, rendering its imposing walls irrelevant. In city after city, French forces were forced to retreat, civilians fled in panic, and German victory became inevitable. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, without a fight, as the French government abandoned its capital. Within days, Marshal Philippe Pétain sued for an armistice, bringing France's proud military tradition to a humiliating halt. For Britain, the fall of France was more than a shock. It was the dawning realization that they now stood alone against the Nazi Empire. The collapse of France was not only military, but also psychological, for it destroyed the illusion that Germany could be contained by the great powers of Europe. Only months earlier, the French and British together had declared war on Germany after its invasion of Poland, yet their armies had been largely inactive during the so-called phony war. Behind the Maginot Line, French troops had waited passively, believing time was on their side, while the British sent only a small expeditionary force. But the German invasion in May 1940 revealed how disastrously unprepared they truly were. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, strafing retreating columns and hammering defensive positions. German armor swept across open fields at lightning pace, leaving Allied generals scrambling to understand a new form of warfare. At Dunkirk, a desperate evacuation saved over 300,000 British and French troops, but the equipment left behind represented the collapse of an entire army. The swift defeat of France stunned the world. Nations from Washington to Moscow reassessed their own defenses in fear of what Germany might do next. Hitler, triumphant, now controlled most of Western Europe. The fall of France was not just a victory, it was the reshaping of the continent into a German-dominated order. For Britain, France's defeat meant isolation. The Royal Navy still commanded the seas, but across the Channel lay a German-occupied coastline stretching from Denmark to the Pyrenees. This was a nightmare scenario. British strategists had long feared the possibility of facing a hostile empire dominating the European mainland. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister only weeks before France's fall, now bore the heavy responsibility of rallying his nation. In speeches broadcast to the world, he promised that Britain would never surrender, declaring that if the island were invaded, the people would fight on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets. Yet behind the inspiring words lay a grim reality. Britain was outnumbered, its army stripped of heavy equipment, and its air defences soon to be tested as never before. The shadow of invasion loomed large, for Hitler now looked across the Channel and envisioned Operation Sea Lion, the planned German assault on the British Isles. The survival of Britain would depend not only on its willpower, but on the outcome of a looming aerial battle that would determine the future of the free world. The French collapse also carried deep consequences for civilians, millions of whom were caught in the chaos of retreat and occupation. Long lines of refugees filled the roads of northern and central France, clogging escape routes as German panzers advanced with terrifying speed. Families abandoned homes with little more than what they could carry, while German aircraft strafed the fleeing columns, adding horror to panic. When Paris fell, the city's population was gripped by shock and disbelief, for few had imagined the French capital could be surrendered so quickly. In the wake of the armistice, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées in triumph, while French citizens watched in despair. The once proud French army, the legacy of Napoleon and Verdun, was broken and humiliated. Marshal Pétain's government, based in Vichy, pledged cooperation with Hitler, effectively splitting France between collaboration and resistance. For Britain, this betrayal was another bitter reminder that no continental ally could now be trusted to hold the line. The German occupation of France was not only a military disaster, but a moral blow to the Allied cause. Germany's victory in France was made possible by the sheer effectiveness of blitzkrieg, a doctrine that redefined modern warfare. Unlike the slow, grinding battles of the First World War, blitzkrieg emphasized speed, surprise, and concentrated force. Tanks spearheaded assaults, supported by close air attacks from dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka, which screamed through the skies, sowing terror before the advancing troops. Radio communications kept units coordinated in real time, allowing them to exploit gaps and weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. The French, by contrast, relied on outdated tactics, rigid chains of command, and static defenses that collapsed once bypassed. German generals such as Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel proved masters of maneuver, driving their armoured columns deep behind enemy lines. In weeks, the Germans achieved what they had failed to do in years during World War I. This stunning transformation of warfare shocked observers across the globe and cemented the belief that Hitler's armies were unstoppable. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a revolution in military science that Britain would soon face directly. With France gone, Europe was remade. Hitler now controlled not only the continent's industrial heartlands, but also its coastlines, ports, and airfields, which provided critical staging grounds for the next phase of the war. Across occupied France, the Germans quickly fortified the Atlantic coast, preparing for long-term domination. Britain was now surrounded by threats, with German submarines prowling the seas and bombers within striking distance of London. The British government prepared for the worst, ordering defences along beaches, setting up barbed wire and pillboxes, and preparing civilian populations for possible invasion. Air raid shelters were dug, gas masks distributed, and the nation braced itself for bombing. The loss of France meant that Britain had lost its buffer. The war was now at its doorstep. Hitler, confident in his momentum, believed that Britain would either negotiate peace or be crushed under the weight of German air and naval superiority. But Churchill understood something Hitler did not, that the spirit of the British people could not be measured in numbers alone. The fall of France also sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, where the United States watched with growing unease. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that Britain's survival was now the front line of freedom against tyranny. Though America remained officially neutral, public opinion began to shift as the scale of German victories became undeniable. Roosevelt ordered an increase in arms production and looked for ways to supply Britain with aid without directly entering the war. Canada, Australia, and other members of the British Empire rallied to the cause, sending men and resources to bolster the island's defence. Yet the sense of isolation in Britain remained stark. Surrounded, outnumbered, and facing a powerful enemy across a narrow sea, Britain seemed to many like the next domino to fall. The collapse of France had transformed the war into a struggle for survival, and Britain was now the last bastion standing between Hitler and total domination of Europe. Thus, by the end of June 1940, the world had entered a new and terrifying chapter. The fall of France was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point that reshaped the balance of power. Germany had risen to unprecedented dominance, its armies unbeaten, its enemies reeling. Britain stood alone, defiant yet vulnerable, preparing for the storm that was surely coming. The stage was set for the Battle of Britain, a clash not only of aircraft and bombs but of wills and destinies. Hitler believed Britain could be brought to its knees by terror from the skies, while Churchill believed that courage and resilience could carry his nation through. The outcome of that looming battle would decide not only Britain's survival, but the fate of freedom itself. Europe lay in shadows, conquered and subdued, while across the Channel a small island nation braced itself for the fight of its life. The fall of France was the prologue to one of history's greatest struggles, and the world watched anxiously to see whether Britain would endure or fall into darkness. In the summer of 1940, with France lying crushed under the heel of the Wehrmacht, Hitler turned his gaze across the English Channel. Britain, battered but unbowed, was now the only major power left standing against his Reich. Yet to bring the island nation to heel, Germany needed more than tanks and artillery. It needed control of the skies and seas. Thus was born Operation Sea Lion, the code name for the invasion of Britain. On paper it promised a swift strike, a crossing of barges and warships, carrying tens of thousands of German troops. But reality was far less simple. The Royal Navy, still the largest fleet in the world, posed a formidable obstacle to any crossing. The Luftwaffe, therefore, was tasked with the most vital role, clearing the skies of the Royal Air Force. Hitler believed Britain could be beaten into submission with bombs before the first soldier stepped onto its shores. The invasion's success depended not on courage alone, but on the balance of air power. The German High Command drafted plans with mechanical precision, outlining timetables, crossing points, and logistical needs. Troops would embark from ports along the Channel coast, Calais, Boulogne, and Le Havre, before striking toward Kent and Sussex. The plan envisioned armoured divisions rolling through southern England and capturing London within weeks. But the English Channel was treacherous, prone to sudden storms and strong currents. German barges, hastily assembled and poorly suited for military landings, risked being swamped in rough seas. The Kriegsmarine, weakened by losses in Norway and dwarfed by Britain's navy, admitted it could not guarantee safe passage. Thus Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised to deliver what the navy could not: total dominance of the skies. If the RAF was destroyed, German ships and barges might slip across unopposed. This gamble placed enormous weight on the Luftwaffe's shoulders. At first glance, The Luftwaffe seemed more than capable of the task, with over 2,500 aircraft, including swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Heinkel, Dornier, and Junkers bombers. It was one of the most powerful air forces in the world. The RAF, by comparison, had fewer than 700 frontline fighters, mostly Hurricanes and Spitfires. German planners believed the campaign would last no more than 4 weeks, but statistics alone masked critical weaknesses. German fighters had limited range, able to stay over southern England for only minutes before fuel forced their return. Bombers, slow and vulnerable, needed constant escort. British radar, an untested technology in combat, promised to give early warning of incoming raids. These details, overlooked in German confidence, would soon prove decisive. The invasion plan, ambitious yet fragile, hung on assumptions that would not hold. The timetable of Operation Sea Lion reflected Hitler's impatience. He ordered preparations to be complete by mid-August 1940, with landings planned for September. The Wehrmacht began amassing troops, barges and supplies in occupied French ports. Maps were studied, beaches selected, and bridges marked for capture. Behind the confident facade, however, doubts plagued German officers. Admiral Erich Raeder of the Kriegsmarine bluntly warned that without air superiority, the invasion was doomed. German generals understood that Britain's fleet could obliterate barges and transports long before they reached English soil. Yet Hitler brushed aside concerns, insisting that the Luftwaffe's superiority would guarantee success. Goering's boast that his air arm could cripple Britain in a matter of days fueled Hitler's conviction. Thus, the entire plan hinged not on naval strength, but on aerial domination. For Hitler, the invasion was more than strategy. It was psychological warfare. He believed Britain was clinging to illusions of safety, shielded by the Channel and its empire. He calculated that relentless bombing of cities, airfields, and ports would break British morale. He imagined Churchill's government collapsing under pressure, perhaps even seeking peace as France had done. Propaganda painted the operation as inevitable, presenting Britain's defeat as a matter of timing rather than possibility. Yet within the British Isles, preparations for defence surged. Beaches were lined with barbed wire, pillboxes, and anti-tank obstacles. Home Guard volunteers drilled with rifles, pikes, and makeshift weapons. Britain, though vulnerable, was determined to resist. Hitler's gamble underestimated not just Britain's defences, but its spirit. The German build-up along the Channel coast was immense, yet chaotic. Thousands of river barges, seized from across occupied Europe, were dragged to ports and fitted with crude ramps for troops and vehicles. Few were seaworthy, and many lacked engines, requiring towing by tugs. Troops trained in mock landings, but few believed these vessels could survive the crossing. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and equipment piled up in depots, awaiting orders that never came. German soldiers stationed along the coast grew restless, uncertain if the invasion would truly materialize. Meanwhile, British intelligence monitored these preparations through spies and aerial reconnaissance. Reports of massing barges alarmed the British public, heightening fears of an imminent invasion. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide Europe's fate. Inside Hitler's inner circle, debate over the invasion raged. Some urged caution, pointing out that Germany lacked the amphibious experience or naval dominance required. Others argued that a rapid strike could succeed if the RAF was destroyed first. Hitler vacillated, torn between launching the invasion or seeking a diplomatic solution. He still entertained hopes that Britain might negotiate, especially if bombed into exhaustion. Yet Churchill's speeches and Britain's defiance only hardened his resolve. The plan remained, but its execution depended on conditions that grew less favorable with each passing week. As summer waned, weather turned unpredictable, reducing the invasion window. German commanders, though obedient, feared they were preparing for a disaster. Operation Sea Lion became less a plan of precision and more a symbol of Hitler's overconfidence. By August 1940, Operation Sea Lion existed as both a threat and a bluff. German propaganda trumpeted its inevitability, aiming to intimidate Britain into surrender. But behind closed doors, many in the German high command doubted it would ever launch. All hinged on the Luftwaffe upcoming campaign to crush the RAF. If Goering failed, the invasion would remain only a paper plan. If he succeeded, Britain might fall before the year's end. Thus, the Battle of Britain was not merely an air campaign, but the very key to Hitler's grand strategy. The skies over southern England would decide whether Operation Sea Lion advanced or vanished into history as an unfulfilled gamble. The fate of Britain, and perhaps the war itself, balanced on the wings of fighter planes. In June 1940, as the echoes of collapsing France still reverberated across Europe, Britain stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. The German Wehrmacht had conquered the Low Countries and crushed the French army in a matter of weeks, leaving the British Expeditionary Force battered and barely rescued from Dunkirk's beaches. The world watched in awe and terror as Hitler's war machine seemed unstoppable, rolling over nation after nation with mechanical precision. Yet in this moment of darkness, Britain refused to surrender to despair. Across the Channel, the swastika flew over Paris, but in London the Union Jack still waved defiantly against the storm. The British Isles were now the last bastion of resistance in Western Europe, an island fortress facing a colossal enemy. This reality was not lost on the people. Everyone understood the gravity of their situation. The sea was no longer just a channel of trade, but now the only barrier between survival and conquest. Every whisper in the streets, every headline in the papers carried the same unspoken truth. Britain was alone, and alone. It would have to prepare for the greatest struggle in its history. At the heart of Britain's preparation stood Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister after Neville Chamberlain's resignation in May 1940. Churchill brought not only political authority, but also an unmatched ability to inspire through words, transforming fear into defiance. His speeches, carried by radio into every home and factory, became the spiritual lifeline of the nation. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender," he declared, his gravelly voice electrifying millions who clung to his words as a shield against despair. But Churchill's leadership was more than rhetoric. He oversaw practical measures that mobilized the country for total war. Ministries were reorganized, industries were redirected, and every ounce of Britain's strength was to be bent toward survival. Volunteers signed up for Home Guard service, while women stepped into factories, producing the planes and ammunition that would become Britain's lifeline. Civil defense drills multiplied, air raid wardens practiced their routines, and blackout curtains were hung in every window. In Churchill, the nation found not only a leader, but a symbol of unyielding defiance, one who personified the spirit of an island unwilling to bow. His presence alone galvanized Britain, reminding the people that unity was their greatest weapon. Preparing to face the Luftwaffe required the rapid strengthening of Britain's aerial shield, the Royal Air Force. At the outbreak of war, the RAF was smaller and less experienced than its German counterpart, but what it lacked in size, it sought to make up in innovation. The backbone of this force would be the sleek Supermarine Spitfire and the rugged Hawker Hurricane, aircraft that were fast becoming legends even before their true test had come. British radar technology, known as chain home, also provided a secret edge, enabling detection of incoming raids long before they reached the coast. This system, overseen by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, gave the RAF an invisible yet decisive advantage in the air war to come. Meanwhile, training programs accelerated at an unprecedented pace, turning raw recruits into fighter pilots with little more than weeks of instruction. The skies over southern England became the proving grounds for these young men, many barely out of school, who would soon be tasked with defending civilization itself. Squadrons formed not only from Britain, but from across the Commonwealth, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and Poles, all united in defense of freedom. Each plane, each pilot, each radar station was a vital cog in the machine of survival. And as preparations continued, the RAF transformed itself from a defensive force into the very shield of the nation. On the ground, civilians braced themselves for an aerial onslaught unlike anything the modern world had seen before. The government introduced air raid precautions with urgency, recognizing that Hitler's bombers would not only target airfields, but cities, industries, and civilian homes. Families were issued gas masks, their eerie, bug-eyed visages becoming a symbol of a nation at war. Anderson shelters, half buried in gardens, became the nightly refuge for millions, while the larger Morrison shelters were assembled inside homes. Cities constructed massive underground bunkers, though for London, the sprawling tube network would soon serve as a vast communal refuge. Posters urged civilians to keep calm and carry on, a slogan that quietly reinforced discipline amid chaos. Children were evacuated from London and other industrial centres, placed on trains to the countryside with tags around their necks. For many families, the parting was heartbreaking, yet necessary to keep the next generation safe. The psychological weight was immense, but Britons bore it with stoic determination, adapting quickly to the routines of blackout sirens and sandbagged doorways. Britain's civilians were not mere bystanders, they too were soldiers of endurance in the war effort. As the days passed, Britain's factories roared into life, transforming the economy into an engine of war. Civilian industries were converted to military production, with car manufacturers building aircraft components and textile factories producing parachutes and uniforms. Women became the backbone of this industrial surge, taking on roles once reserved for men, symbolizing a social revolution accelerated by necessity. The munitionettes, as they came to be called, worked long hours under hazardous conditions, forging the weapons and tools that would keep Britain alive. The output of fighter planes was prioritized above all, with the Air Ministry demanding relentless production schedules. By mid-1940, Hurricanes and Spitfires were rolling off the assembly lines at a pace that astonished even seasoned commanders. Behind every pilot in the sky stood thousands of unseen laborers, engineers and mechanics, whose work ensured that machines of war could rise to meet the Luftwaffe. In this mobilization, Britain discovered a hidden strength, the collective determination of its people to contribute, each in their own way, to the nation's defense. The war was no longer distant, it was on every assembly line, in every kitchen, in every field. The nation itself became a weapon. The Home Guard, famously nicknamed Dad's Army, became another symbol of Britain's resilience. Composed of men too old, too young, or otherwise unable to serve in the regular forces, the Home Guard was tasked with defending the nation in case of invasion. Armed at first with little more than improvised weapons, pitchforks, shotguns, and even broom handles, they embodied a spirit of defiance that was as psychological as it was practical. Training drills took place in parks and village greens, while makeshift roadblocks and defense posts appeared across the countryside. Though ridiculed at times, the Home Guard's presence reassured communities that no town or village would be left undefended. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and clerks all donned armbands and stood ready to repel paratroopers or saboteurs. Over time, the Home Guard received better weapons and equipment, slowly transforming into a credible defensive force. More than 1 million men volunteered, proving that Britain's defense rested not only on professional soldiers, but on the willingness of ordinary people to fight for their homeland. Their very existence sent a message to Hitler. Even if his armies crossed the Channel, they would find resistance on every street. The Home Guard, in its humble determination, reflected the broader character of Britain in 1940. Yet, amid preparation, fear remained a constant companion. The threat of invasion loomed large, with German propaganda promising that the swastika would soon fly over Buckingham Palace. Maps circulated among the populace, showing likely landing sites, and coastal towns dug trenches and erected obstacles against an imagined enemy. The possibility of German tanks rolling across English fields haunted both civilians and military planners. Yet this fear did not paralyze the nation. It steeled it. The government drilled into the public the need for vigilance, report suspicious activities, remain calm during raids, trust the armed forces. Children carried identity cards, families stocked emergency rations, and communities rehearsed evacuation plans. Even entertainment adapted, with cinemas playing patriotic newsreels before films, reminding audiences of their shared struggle. Fear and defiance coexisted, woven together into a fabric of resilience that bound the nation tightly. This was not merely preparation for war, it was preparation for survival itself. So, by the summer of 1940, Britain had transformed itself into an armed fortress, bracing for the storm to come. The skies hummed with the sound of training aircraft, the fields and factories echoed with production, and the streets buzzed with both anxiety and determination. Churchill's voice continued to rally the nation, his words reminding Britons that they were the front line of freedom. Across the island, the Royal Air Force stood ready, its young pilots awaiting their trial by fire. Civilians slept in shelters, kept their blackout curtains drawn, and prayed for deliverance. The Home Guard stood watch in the countryside, while soldiers patrolled the coasts, scanning the horizon for invasion barges. Britain had not chosen this fate, but it embraced it with courage and unyielding resolve. Alone the island stood, yet it did not stand in silence. Instead, it awaited its destiny, prepared for the battle that would decide not only the fate of the nation, but the course of history itself. The storm was coming, and Britain was ready. When Hitler turned his gaze across the Channel, he placed immense faith in Hermann Göring and his Luftwaffe, believing air power alone could crush Britain into submission. At the height of the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe stood as one of the largest and most formidable aerial forces the world had ever seen, boasting thousands of modern aircraft and a corps of experienced pilots seasoned by campaigns in Spain, Poland, Norway, and France. To many observers, it seemed inevitable that Britain's Royal Air Force would be swept aside by the sheer weight of German air might. Yet beneath this intimidating facade lay flaws, blind spots, and overconfidence that would eventually prove disastrous. Göring promised Hitler swift domination of British skies, presenting air superiority as a certainty rather than a challenge. The Luftwaffe was designed for short, powerful strikes in support of ground operations, not for extended strategic air campaigns across hostile waters. Logistics, range, and coordination would soon show themselves as weaknesses when tested against Britain's geography. Still, in the summer of 1940, German pilots took to their machines with the pride of conquerors, convinced their momentum was unstoppable. Their leaders had no reason, at least yet, to doubt them. The Battle of Britain was about to test every assumption. These are it. The backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter force was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek, deadly and battle-proven, considered by many as the most advanced single-engine fighter of its time. With a top speed exceeding 350 miles per hour and armed with machine guns and cannons, it gave German pilots a lethal advantage in dogfights. Supporting it was the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110, a heavy fighter originally designed to dominate the skies, but whose limitations would soon be exposed against nimble British aircraft. The bombers of the Luftwaffe carried the destructive weight of the campaign. The Heinkel He 111, with its distinctive glazed nose, became the workhorse of daylight raids. Alongside it flew the Dornier Du 17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil for its slender frame, and the fearsome Junkers Du 88, versatile enough to perform as both a dive bomber and medium bomber. Yet perhaps no aircraft struck fear into the hearts of ground troops more than the Junkers Du 87, Stuka, its screaming sirens designed to paralyze enemy morale as bombs whistled earthward. The Luftwaffe possessed both diversity and numbers, a combination Hitler trusted would overwhelm Britain. To the German High Command, this fleet represented a modern juggernaut, but in practice these machines would face challenges for which they were not originally designed. Luftwaffe strategy for Britain was shaped by overconfidence and miscalculation, beginning with Goering's assumption that the Royal Air Force would collapse within weeks. The initial plan called for sweeping attacks on coastal defences, airfields and radar stations to systematically dismantle fighter command. Once RAF fighters were destroyed, the bombers would be free to strike ports, factories and eventually London itself, preparing the way for Operation Sea Lion. In Goering's view, it was a straightforward sequence: knock Britain's air defences down like dominoes and clear the skies for German dominance. What he did not anticipate was the resilience of radar, the determination of RAF pilots, and the layered command system that coordinated British defences with precision. German intelligence grossly underestimated the true strength of fighter command, believing it to be on the verge of collapse when, in reality, reserves remained. The Luftwaffe's doctrine of short-range, concentrated strikes worked well on the continent, but Britain's geography presented longer distances, fuel constraints, and the challenge of fighting over enemy territory. German pilots had minutes of combat time before fuel forced their retreat across the Channel, while British pilots fought above their own soil. These tactical realities would slowly erode Goering's strategy. What looked simple on paper became a brutal grind in the skies. Another miscalculation lay in Goering's leadership style, which blended arrogance with inconsistency. Known for his flamboyant uniforms and self-indulgence, Goering often dismissed technical concerns from his commanders and placed political loyalty above sound military judgment. He promised Hitler results that were unrealistic, leaving the Luftwaffe bound to objectives it could not achieve. Instead of prioritizing systematic destruction of radar and command systems, Goering repeatedly shifted focus, sometimes targeting airfields, other times ports, and later cities. This lack of consistency prevented the Luftwaffe from sustaining pressure in any single domain long enough to break British defences. His refusal to acknowledge the limitations of the Bf 110 or the vulnerabilities of daylight bombers in hostile skies would cost countless German airmen their lives. Furthermore, his constant boasting about the Luftwaffe's superiority lulled Hitler into believing Britain's fall was inevitable. But as weeks passed and British resistance refused to crumble, Goering's bravado began to look like delusion. The seeds of German defeat were sown not only in the skies, but in the flawed judgments of its leadership. Pride, as history would prove, became one of the Luftwaffe's greatest weaknesses. Central to the Luftwaffe's overconfidence was its earlier record of success. In Poland, the air arm had pulverized Polish defences in days, softening resistance for the Wehrmacht advance. In Norway, it dominated the skies, enabling rapid occupation of key ports and cities. In France, it shredded the French and British air forces in weeks, ensuring the rapid success of Blitzkrieg. These victories convinced both Hitler and Goering that the Luftwaffe was invincible, a hammer that could shatter any obstacle placed in its path. The assumption was that Britain would be no different, a mere extension of earlier campaigns. Yet those earlier victories were achieved against enemies caught unprepared, outnumbered, or poorly coordinated. Britain was different. Its defences were modern, integrated, and bolstered by geography. The English Channel acted as both a shield and a challenge, forcing German aircraft to stretch their capabilities while Britain's pilots fought close to home. Past triumphs had blinded Goering to these differences. History, however, would demonstrate that every battlefield demands its own strategy. Dabei is. The Luftwaffe's approach to bombing was also flawed in its assumptions. Believing terror would break morale, German commanders deployed Stukas and medium bombers against towns and cities, expecting the population to buckle under fear. In reality, the opposite occurred. Raids hardened British resolve, drawing civilians closer together in defiance of the enemy above. Moreover, the bombers themselves were not designed for long-range, high-payload missions. Lacking four-engine heavy bombers, like the British Lancaster or American B-17, Germany relied on medium bombers with limited striking power. While effective in short, concentrated raids, they lacked the devastating capacity needed to cripple Britain's industry in a sustained campaign. Furthermore, German bombers often flew without adequate fighter escort, exposing them to devastating losses when intercepted by Hurricanes and Spitfires. Goering's faith in the Bf 110 as a long-range escort fighter proved misguided, as the twin-engine aircraft was sluggish and vulnerable against single-seat RAF fighters. Each of these weaknesses, once revealed, chipped away at the aura of invincibility. Confidence began to falter as reality set in. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the Battle of Britain was meant to be a continuation of their unstoppable march across Europe. Many entered the campaign with bravado, expecting quick victories and glory in the skies above England. They flew machines they trusted, under commanders who promised them triumph, and against an enemy they were told was already faltering. But as the weeks dragged on, these same pilots encountered an adversary that fought with resilience, skill, and home field advantage. Losses mounted steadily, with many of Germany's most experienced flyers shot down over fields and towns they had never seen before. Returning across the Channel often meant bringing back battered aircraft or seeing empty places in the formations. Fatigue set in, morale wavered, and the grim reality of Britain's strength began to sink in. Goering's promises of quick victory gave way to frustration as his orders became increasingly erratic. The Luftwaffe, for all its might, was beginning to feel the first sting of real resistance. And the worst was still to come. In hindsight, the Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain with undeniable power, but also with fatal flaws that would soon unravel. Its aircraft were formidable, but limited by range and role. Its leadership was confident, but strategically inconsistent. Its doctrine was aggressive, but ill-suited for prolonged aerial warfare over hostile territory. Most of all, its assumptions about Britain were rooted in arrogance, not analysis. The Luftwaffe believed it could bend the will of a nation by force of air alone, yet underestimated the resilience of both the RAF and the British people. For Goering, the campaign would mark a turning point. from boastful confidence to bitter frustration. For Hitler, it was the first major check to his seemingly unstoppable conquest of Europe. And for the Luftwaffe, it marked the beginning of a long decline from which it would never fully recover. The Battle of Britain was not simply an air campaign, it was the moment where German air power met its limits. In the tense summer of 1940, as the shadow of invasion loomed, Britain's survival hinged not only on courage, but on organization and foresight. At the heart of this defense stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command, a man of quiet reserve and unshakable conviction. Dowding was not a flamboyant leader, but a strategist whose genius lay in preparation and innovation, seeing further than most into the future of warfare. He understood that modern air defense would not be decided solely by the bravery of pilots in cockpits, but by the creation of a coordinated system, an invisible web of technology, communication, and command. This was the Dowding system, a network unlike anything seen before, weaving radar, observers, and centralized control into a single fighting machine. While German planners assumed air combat would be a duel of numbers and individual engagements, Dowding's vision ensured every aircraft and every pilot was directed with surgical precision. His belief was simple: Britain's limited resources must be multiplied through efficiency, leaving no room for waste. This philosophy turned fighter command into a weapon of calculated defense, able to absorb the Luftwaffe's blows and strike back with deadly timing. At its center lay Dowding's unyielding discipline, his refusal to gamble, and his understanding that a single misstep could bring the island nation to ruin. To many he was aloof and distant, but to history he was indispensable. The brilliance of Dowding's system began with one of Britain's secret weapons, radar, known as radio direction finding at the time. It stretched along the southern and eastern coasts of England in towering masts that seemed almost crude, yet held unmatched power. This chain, called Chain Home, could detect incoming German aircraft while they were still forming over the Channel, long before they reached British shores. The Luftwaffe believed in speed and surprise, but radar stripped away that advantage, giving fighter command precious minutes to prepare squadrons, fuel engines, and climb to altitude. In an age when air defense had traditionally meant reacting blindly to incoming bombers, Dowding's radar stations provided clarity and anticipation. Each blip on the screen was relayed instantly to control centers, where intelligence officers pieced together the enemy's movements like a vast jigsaw puzzle. This meant that every British fighter could be launched not in guesswork, but in direct response to real-time enemy positioning. It was as if the skies themselves had been opened to Dowding's eyes, and with this sight, he could direct his outnumbered fighters with maximum efficiency. What radar provided was not just early warning, but the precious gift of time to organize, time to choose where to fight, and time to conserve strength. This was the cornerstone of Britain's defensive wall, invisible yet unbreakable. But radar was only one pillar of the system. Beyond the coastline, deep within England, a vast network of observers and spotters added another layer of defense. The Royal Observer Corps, composed largely of civilians armed with binoculars and notebooks, filled the gaps radar could not cover, especially at lower altitudes. These men and women stood watch on rooftops, hills, and fields, eyes scanning the sky, ears tuned for the distant growl of engines. Each sighting was telephoned in with remarkable speed, feeding into local control centers where data from radar and observation posts converged. Together, these streams of intelligence painted a complete picture of the incoming threat, from high-altitude bomber formations to lone strafing fighters hugging the ground. It was an extraordinary feat of national coordination, binding civilians and military professionals into one seamless chain of defense. The observer corps became the human element in a mechanical system, filling it with vigilance and dedication. Their reports, often made under the threat of falling bombs, added texture and accuracy to Dowding's aerial map. For many, it was their contribution to the fight, their way of standing against the Nazi menace, and their efforts ensured that no enemy aircraft went unnoticed. Without them, radar would have been a half-finished tool. With them, it became a shield that stretched from the skies to the very fields of Britain. Once this web of information was gathered, it flowed to the beating heart of fighter command, the filter rooms and operations centers. Here, teams of plotters, mostly young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, stood around large maps, pushing markers across boards with wooden rods. Each marker represented a formation of aircraft, either enemy or friendly, tracked in real time. Officers called tellers relayed the information up the chain of command, allowing decisions to be made with breathtaking speed. This was no random scramble of pilots rushing to intercept. It was a carefully orchestrated ballet of war. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, which defended southeast England, was the master of this coordination. Park, a New Zealander with combat experience from the First World War, had the temperament of a fighter and the mind of a tactician. He operated the sector stations like the control tower of a vast machine, launching squadrons only where they were needed most, and ensuring that none were wasted on fruitless chases. Every minute mattered, and Park turned minutes into victories, shaping the battle with a firm but calculated hand. Without his mastery of the system, Dowding's vision would have been little more than theory. With Park in command, it became a living reality. The sector stations themselves were marvels of efficiency, each a miniature hub of control that allowed squadrons to be directed with pinpoint precision. Every sector had its airfields, its ready pilots, and its own chain of communications feeding into the wider system. Pilots waiting in dispersal huts could be scrambled at a moment's notice, engines roaring to life as ground crews pushed them onto runways. Within minutes, they were climbing into the sky, not wandering blindly but heading directly toward enemy formations whose positions had been calculated down to the mile. This system of controlled interception meant that even though Britain had far fewer aircraft than the Luftwaffe, each one counted more. Fighters were never wasted on false alarms or wild hunts. They struck where it mattered most, maximizing destruction while minimizing losses. The German assumption that numerical superiority would overwhelm the RAF was shattered by this precision. The sector system multiplied Britain's strength, turning scarcity into advantage. It was an invisible force multiplier, ensuring that every Spitfire and Hurricane was worth its weight in gold. In a war of attrition, where every plane saved could fight again tomorrow, this efficiency proved priceless. The Luftwaffe had numbers, fighter command had a system. Hugh Dowding's style of leadership was often criticized within the Air Ministry, yet it was precisely his refusal to yield to politics that preserved fighter command. Known as Stuffy Dowding, he was a man of reserve, often aloof, and sometimes difficult to work with. Yet beneath this exterior lay a fierce loyalty to his pilots and an unshakable belief in the system he had built. He resisted attempts to send more fighters to France in the spring of 1940, a decision that left him accused of selfishness, but ultimately saved Britain's air defences from collapse. He understood that the coming battle would not be won in the fields of France, but in the skies over England. His insistence on keeping reserves, on holding back squadrons until they were truly needed, often brought him into conflict with more aggressive voices who demanded boldness and immediate action. But Dowding was not swayed by ego or theatrics. He measured every decision against one principle: Britain must not run out of fighters. In this he was both cautious and visionary, recognizing that a commander's greatest duty was not to win a single battle, but to preserve the ability to keep fighting. History would vindicate him, though not without cost to his career. Equally essential was Keith Park, the man on the front lines of Fighter Command's execution. Park commanded Nober 11 Group, the shield over London and the southeast, the region most threatened by German invasion. His command was the hardest hit, enduring the full weight of Luftwaffe bombing raids day after day. Park's philosophy was rooted in pragmatism, to intercept the enemy as late as possible, over friendly territory, ensuring that downed pilots could survive and fight again. This meant that British squadrons often engaged the enemy almost directly over their targets, a risky strategy that saved resources while maximizing effectiveness. Park's calm demeanor and tactical acumen earned him the respect of his men, even as he faced relentless pressure from both superiors and subordinates. He was the perfect counterpart to Dowding. Where Dowding provided the system, Park provided the operational instinct to use it. Together they created a defense that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency, yet deeply human in its reliance on courage and endurance. Park's role in holding the line over southern England cannot be overstated. Without his unflinching resolve, the Luftwaffe might have forced the cracks that could bring the system crashing down. The Dowding system, with its radar chain, observer network, filter rooms, and sector controls, was the first fully integrated air defense system in history. It transformed air warfare from a series of chaotic encounters into a coordinated campaign of defense and counterstrike. The Luftwaffe never fully understood the sophistication of what they faced, assuming British resilience came only from brave pilots, rather than from an entire nation wired into a machine of survival. In truth, the pilots were only the sharp tip of a much larger spear, guided by thousands of unseen hands. Dowding and Park had forged a weapon that turned Britain's geographical vulnerability into a fortress, with the English Channel as a moat and the skies above as battlements. The Battle of Britain would test this system as never before, pushing it to the brink, but its strength lay in its design and the foresight of those who created it. Against the onslaught of German power, Britain would not merely endure, it would stand, because every radar mast, every observer, every plotter, and every pilot was part of one seamless whole. The Dowding system was more than strategy, it was survival, and it would prove decisive in the struggle to come. They would come to be known simply as the few, a phrase immortalized in Winston Churchill's stirring words, but in the summer of 1940, they were flesh and blood. Young men barely out of school, men hardened by previous wars, and foreigners who had lost their homelands to the Nazi tide. The pilots of Fighter Command represented the last fragile shield between Britain and conquest. Some had trained in peacetime flying clubs, others had earned their wings in the chaos of foreign wars, and still others had been thrust into cockpits with barely enough hours of instruction to know how to keep their aircraft in the sky. Their backgrounds were diverse, but their task was singular: to defend the skies over Britain with their very lives. In their leather helmets and oxygen masks, they seemed larger than life, yet many were no older than 20. The average RAF fighter pilot in 1940 was just 20 years and 8 months old, an age when most of their peers would still be studying or working their first civilian jobs. They flew into combat not knowing whether they would return even for the next meal. This youthful fragility, coupled with extraordinary courage, became the defining image of the Battle of Britain. They were not faceless figures in history books. They were individuals with names, faces, and stories that would echo across generations. Among them were the British pilots, the backbone of Fighter Command. many of whom had been raised in a culture of service and duty to the crown. For them, the war was not only about survival, but about defending their families, their homes, and their very island against the threat of invasion. They flew Hurricanes and Spitfires with a fierce determination, often taking off multiple times a day in grueling sorties. Their nights were restless, spent in bunks at forward airfields, where the roar of scrambling engines was never far away. They carried the weight of expectation, as newspapers lionized their bravery, while quietly recording the growing list of those who would not return. Some came from privileged backgrounds, products of England's public schools, while others were working-class lads, whose grit and resilience made them natural warriors of the skies. Together they represented Britain's standalone defiance in 1940. Their heroism was not measured in statistics, but in the sheer will to rise again and again into the air against impossible odds. To the people watching from below, their contrails painted streaks of hope across the skies. And for those who survived each mission, the relief was only temporary, as another sortie always awaited. This Keedles to share. Yet, the British were not alone. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Battle of Britain was its international character, with foreign pilots flooding into fighter command from nations already crushed under Nazi occupation. The Poles stood out among them, bringing with them a fury born of loss and humiliation. Having seen their homeland carved up by Hitler and Stalin, Polish pilots flew with a vengeance that astonished their British counterparts. Squadron 303, composed largely of Polish airmen, became one of the most successful units of the entire battle. They were aggressive, fearless, and often impatient with the cautious tactics favored by the RAF hierarchy. Their language barrier was overcome by sheer determination and the universal language of combat in the skies. To the Poles, every German aircraft shot down was not only a tactical victory, but a personal act of revenge. Their courage inspired both their comrades and the British public, who marveled at their skill and spirit. Though displaced and exiled, they were fighting for the hope that someday their country would be free again. However, the Czechoslovakian pilots, too, found their way into the ranks of fighter command, carrying the bitter memory of their homeland's betrayal at Munich. They had fought with the French Air Force before France collapsed, and now they carried their fight to Britain, unwilling to accept the Nazi domination of Europe. For them, the cockpit of a Spitfire was more than a machine of war. It was a vessel of redemption. Each sortie was a chance to reclaim lost honor and to prove to the world that their nation, though silenced, was not extinguished. Their combat experience, honed over months of war, added valuable expertise to the RAF's defensive arsenal. Alongside the Czechs were pilots from Belgium, France, and even neutral nations, each driven by a personal calling to resist tyranny. They became brothers in arms to the British, sharing in the same dangers, losses, and victories. In their presence, fighter command transformed from a purely British force into a symbol of global resistance against fascism. Their sacrifices were a reminder that this battle, though fought over England, was part of a struggle for the freedom of all Europe. From across the Atlantic came volunteers from Canada, the United States, and the wider British Commonwealth. Canadians made up the largest foreign contingent after the Poles, bringing with them the confidence and resourcefulness of a young nation tied by bonds of empire. Their contribution was not only measured in pilots, but also in ground crews, technicians, and logistical support that kept fighter command running. South African and New Zealand pilots, some with experience from earlier campaigns, added to the multinational mosaic. For them, the skies over southern England were far from home, yet the cause was the same: the defense of democracy against tyranny. The Americans, though their nation remained neutral, slipped across the border into Canada to enlist with the RAF. They became part of the famous Eagle Squadrons, a symbol of the growing bond between Britain and the United States. These men risked not only their lives, but also their citizenship, as American law forbade such service at the time. Their willingness to defy neutrality reflected a deep conviction that the fight against Nazism was a cause larger than any single nation's politics. The cost of this battle fell heavily upon the pilots themselves, whose lives were marked by exhaustion, danger, and the ever-present shadow of death. Each day, they climbed into cockpits, knowing the odds stacked against them. Fighter command suffered attrition at a terrifying rate, with replacement pilots often thrown into combat after just a few weeks of training. Many were killed on their very first sortie, their names added to the long roll of the fallen before they had even learned the rhythms of air combat. The survivors often carried the psychological scars of watching their friends go down in flames beside them. They lived with a grim ritual, the empty chair in the mess, the personal belongings returned to grieving families, the quiet acknowledgement that tomorrow it could be their turn. Alcohol, cigarettes, and dark humor became coping mechanisms in the rare moments of respite. The phrase "never in the field of human conflict" was so much owed by so many to so few was not hyperbole. It was the stark truth of a nation surviving on the thin line drawn by these men. Their sacrifice was immeasurable, their burden unthinkable, yet they bore it with courage that continues to resonate through history. Their daily routines were a blend of monotony and sheer terror. Long hours of waiting, punctuated by sudden, frantic scrambles into the sky, tested their nerves to the breaking point. Pilots often played cards, napped in deck chairs, or lounged in dispersal huts until the shrill sound of the scramble bell sent them sprinting to their aircraft. Within minutes, they were airborne, climbing at full throttle to intercept incoming German raids. Dogfights erupted suddenly, lasting only minutes, but those minutes were filled with blinding speed, deadly precision, and life-or-death decisions. The strain on their bodies was immense, as they endured violent maneuvers, crushing G-forces, and the suffocating claustrophobia of their cockpits. Fuel and ammunition were limited, meaning every encounter was brief but decisive. Returning to base, they often found the airfield pitted with bomb craters, their comrades gone, or their own aircraft riddled with holes. Then the cycle began again. Wait, scramble, fight, survive, or perish. It was this relentless rhythm that defined the Battle of Britain. In the end, what bound these men together was not their nationality, nor their backgrounds, but their shared sacrifice in one of history's most desperate struggles. They were ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances, whose actions shaped the course of the Second World War. Their bravery was not abstract. It was real, lived moment to moment in the skies over southern England. When Churchill later spoke of the few, he gave them immortality, ensuring that their deeds would never fade into obscurity. The gratitude of their nation, and indeed the free world, was etched into their memory. The Battle of Britain was not only a clash of machines and strategies, it was the story of these men united in defiance against overwhelming odds. Their victory was not merely military, it was moral, symbolic, and enduring. And though many would not live to see the war's end, their legacy would echo through the decades as proof of what courage and determination could achieve when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. As July 1940 dawned, the English Channel, so often a quiet stretch of water, dotted with fishing boats and merchant convoys, suddenly became a battlefield. Hitler's plans for Operation Sea Lion required dominance over these waters, and the Luftwaffe turned its attention to convoys carrying coal, food, and war materials vital to Britain's survival. The raids began as probing actions, designed not only to sink ships, but also to lure the Royal Air Force into combat over the narrow seas. German reconnaissance aircraft swept across the Channel, testing response times, plotting radar coverage, and gauging the ability of Britain's defenders to scramble fighters in time. Convoys codenamed Bread and Peewit became moving targets, their slow movement across the waves exposing them to air attack. Heinkel bombers droned in at medium altitude, escorted by swift Messerschmitt Bf 109s, while Stuka dive bombers shrieked down almost vertically, sowing chaos and destruction. On the water, the Royal Navy dispatched destroyers to guard shipping lanes, but their anti-aircraft fire often struggled against coordinated waves of German attack. For the first time, Britain's sea lifelines were openly threatened in daylight, and each engagement offered Berlin valuable intelligence. Yet the Channel skirmishes were not decisive blows, they were rehearsals for a storm yet to come. The convoy code-named Peewit became one of the most infamous targets of this early testing period. On August 8th, it sailed from the Thames estuary, bound for the West Country, its holds filled with coal and supplies essential for industry. The Luftwaffe saw an opportunity to unleash coordinated raids, and formations of WW2 Stukas swooped down with sirens screaming, scattering sailors across their decks in terror. British fighter squadrons scrambled desperately to intercept, their Hurricanes diving in among the bombers to break up their attack runs. The clash escalated into a swirling dogfight over the narrow sea, where pilots could see both the white cliffs of Dover and the enemy coastline in the same glance. Several merchantmen were struck and sank in plumes of smoke and flame, their crews struggling for survival in the cold waters. Yet Fighter Command's presence ensured that the Luftwaffe did not enjoy an easy victory. Losses on both sides mounted, but the Germans counted the raid as a measure of success, proving they could strike at will against Britain's vulnerable shipping lanes. For the British, the lessons were sobering. Shipping in daylight would require heavier escorts, tighter convoy formations, and constant air cover. The Channel battles revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Luftwaffe's strategy. While German dive bombers could deliver precision strikes, they were highly vulnerable to interception, and when Hurricanes or Spitfires caught them without escort, Stuka squadrons suffered brutal losses. Messerschmitt 109s, though formidable, had limited range over the Channel, and many pilots found themselves fighting with one eye on the fuel gauge, forced to disengage before the battle had truly run its course. The British, meanwhile, relied on their integrated defense system, using radar to detect incoming raids and filtering reports through sector stations that directed squadrons into action. For the first time, this network was tested under the pressure of sustained combat, and although coordination was not always perfect, it allowed Fighter Command to respond with surprising efficiency. Each skirmish became both a tactical contest and a training ground, sharpening pilots' instincts and refining command procedures. Yet Churchill and Dowding knew that these were only the opening exchanges. The true test, an all-out attempt to gain air superiority, was still waiting on the horizon. Life for the merchant crews caught in these raids was a nightmare of sudden terror. One moment the Channel appeared calm, with gulls circling overhead, and the steady churn of engines carrying them westward. The next, the sky split open with the wail of Stuka sirens and the thunder of bombs crashing into the water. Survivors recalled clinging to wreckage as flames spread across the sea, watching comrades drown or vanish beneath sinking hulls. Destroyer escorts dashed frantically through the chaos, firing their anti-aircraft guns skyward, but the speed of the German attacks often left them powerless to save every vessel. In Britain, the loss of convoys carried a psychological toll as well as a material one. Newspapers reported the sinkings in stark headlines, reminding the public that Hitler's reach extended even into home waters. Yet despite the danger, merchant sailors continued to crew these convoys, their courage ensuring that Britain's industries and cities were not starved of supplies. They too became part of the battle, unarmed but indispensable, enduring the Luftwaffe's fury in the narrow seas. For the Luftwaffe High Command, the Channel skirmishes were carefully studied as laboratories of war. Goering's staff examined the results of each raid, noting where British fighters appeared, how quickly they intercepted, and what tactics they used to break up formations. The Germans sought to identify weaknesses, perhaps an over-reliance on certain squadrons, or delays in the coordination of escorts. These early engagements convinced Berlin that the RAF could be drawn into battle at times and places of the Luftwaffe's choosing, giving them confidence that a larger offensive might succeed. Yet in their analysis lay dangerous overconfidence, for while the British lost ships, they preserved the heart of fighter command. Pilots gained invaluable experience, squadron leaders learned how to manage complex interceptions, and the Dowding system was refined under real combat stress. Every convoy battle cost Britain in tonnage, but it bought time in knowledge. Time that would soon prove critical when the full weight of the Luftwaffe descended upon the island. For RAF pilots, the Channel battles were a baptism of fire. Many were still fresh from training schools, where aerial combat had been simulated but never truly felt. Now over the narrow waters, they faced the terror of tracer rounds stitching across their cockpits, of Messerschmitts appearing suddenly out of the sun, of watching comrades vanish in explosions or spiraling wrecks. Veterans recalled the smell of cordite, the sweat inside oxygen masks, and the shudder of hurricanes straining under tight turns. Yet alongside the fear came a sharpening of resolve. The young men of fighter command began to believe they could stand against Germany's best, that their machines and tactics could hold their own. Each sortie left its scars, planes riddled with bullet holes, pilots wounded or lost, but the survivors carried forward lessons that would harden them for the decisive battles to come. It was here above the convoys of July and August that the few truly began to earn their name. The Channel skirmishes also revealed to the British public that the war had shifted into a new and perilous phase. Along the coasts of Kent and Sussex, civilians looked up from beaches and seaside towns to see formations of bombers and fighters weaving contrails across the sky. Gunfire echoed from the cliffs, and sometimes burning wreckage fell into the waves or onto fields nearby. Children collected shell fragments as trophies, while families huddled in air raid shelters during sudden alarms. The sense of isolation grew sharper. Britain was no longer merely resisting on distant battlefields, but was now defending its very doorstep. Churchill used these moments to remind the nation of the stakes, weaving stories of bravery into his speeches, and urging civilians to steel themselves for worse to come. The Channel was no longer a moat of safety, it had become a front line. By the end of these early battles, one truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had tested Britain, and found a defender both stubborn and adaptive. The convoys suffered, but they sailed again, and each new attempt to break them was met with greater resistance. Fighter command had not been lured into destruction, as Goering hoped, but had instead grown stronger, its pilots seasoned by combat, and its command system refined. Yet the cost was real. Planes lost, lives cut short, ships sunk beneath the waves. The Channel had become a proving ground, but the true contest lay ahead, when Germany shifted its focus from shipping lanes to the airfields, radar stations, and cities of Britain itself. These were only the first sparks of a much larger fire, one that would soon consume the skies over southern England. The Battle of Britain was no longer a looming possibility. It had already begun. August 13th, 1940, dawned with the promise of thunder, though not from the heavens, but from the roaring engines of hundreds of aircraft preparing for battle. The Luftwaffe, following months of probing and scattered attacks, was ready to launch its first concentrated offensive against Britain's defences. The Germans called this day Adler Tag, Eagle Day, a name chosen by Hermann Göring himself to symbolise the mighty strike that would supposedly break the backbone of the Royal Air Force. Plans had been meticulously drawn up. Coordinated waves of bombers escorted by swarms of fighters would sweep across the Channel to cripple airfields, radar stations, and command posts. But the meticulously drawn maps and timetables could not account for one of war's oldest adversaries: weather. Heavy fog, low cloud cover, and sudden bursts of rain disrupted takeoffs across northern France, leading to confusion even before the first bombs fell. Yet Göring, unwilling to delay his grand spectacle, ordered the attacks to proceed regardless of conditions. In his mind, Britain's defences would soon crumble, whether or not the skies cooperated. At last, the largest coordinated aerial assault of the war so far was set into motion, and for the defenders of Britain, the day would prove a brutal trial of endurance, courage, and resolve. The Luftwaffe's plan on Eagle Day was as ambitious as it was complex. Nearly 1,500 sorties were scheduled, with Heinkel 111C, Dornier Du 17S, and Junkers Ju 88S carrying the brunt of the bombing mission. They were to be escorted by Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, which would sweep ahead to clear the skies of Hurricanes and Spitfires. Additional protection was to be provided by the slower but heavily armed Bf 110 twin-engine fighters, though these had already begun to reveal their vulnerability in earlier skirmishes. The primary targets were spread across southern England, with a special focus on fighter command's forward airfields in Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire. Radar installations along the coast, those strange, spindly towers the Germans had underestimated, were also on the list. If executed flawlessly, the plan could cripple the RAF's ability to detect and intercept enemy formations, leaving Britain open to devastating follow-up raids. But complexity often breeds chaos, and the fog of war combined with actual fog ensured delays and errors. Some bomber groups took off too late, others arrived too early, and entire waves missed their scheduled escorts. The great day began not with synchronized precision, but with fractured assaults that tested British defences piecemeal, rather than all at once. For the men of Fighter Command, Eagle Day began like any other summer morning in the long, tense weeks of 1940. Pilots gathered in dispersal huts near their aircraft, sipping lukewarm tea and scanning the cloudy skies for signs of incoming formations. Controllers at Fighter Command's filter rooms sat poised over plotting tables, where markers representing radar contacts were shifted with each new report from the coastal stations. At first, the reports came sporadically, small blips suggesting reconnaissance flights or tentative probes. Then the tables lit up with wave after wave, entire swaths of airspace suddenly filling with hostile aircraft. Sirens wailed across airfields as pilots sprinted to their machines, pulling on goggles and strapping themselves into cockpits with practiced speed. Engines roared to life, the sound mingling with the beating hearts of young men who knew that this was no drill. Squadrons were scrambled in quick succession, Spitfires climbing for height, Hurricanes angling to intercept bombers. The calm before the storm had vanished. Now the skies over southern England darkened with approaching fleets of aircraft. The Battle of Britain had begun in earnest, and its outcome hung in the balance. Duel. The first major clashes erupted over the Sussex coast, where formations of Dornier bombers approached under fighter escort. Spitfires, climbing from bases further inland, sought to engage the BF-109S head-on, while Hurricanes dived toward the bombers themselves. The clash unfolded in a fury of twisting dogfights, engines screaming as pilots pulled their aircraft into desperate maneuvers. Tracers lanced through the clouds, the sky momentarily resembling a storm of sparks as machine guns rattled from every direction. Hurricanes scored hits on several bombers, sending one Dornier spiraling into the channel below in a plume of smoke. But the German escorts were relentless, pouncing on isolated British fighters and forcing them into defensive turns. The melee was so intense that squadrons often became scattered, with individual duels fought miles apart from the main formation. For civilians watching from below, it seemed as if the heavens themselves had turned into a battlefield, the roar of engines mixing with the distant thud of bombs. And though Britain's defenders struck hard, the Luftwaffe pressed on, determined to reach their targets. Despite the chaos, the radar network once again proved its worth. Even as German squadrons shifted routes to avoid interception, the chain of radar stations continued to feed vital information to fighter command. At Bentley Priory, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's command centre operated with remarkable efficiency, directing squadrons precisely where they were needed most. Keith Park, commanding Noberbro New PPC 11 Group, bore the brunt of the action, skillfully managing his forces to balance interception with preservation of strength. His squadrons fought bravely, but were not thrown into the fight all at once. Instead, Park rotated them carefully, ensuring that replacements were ready as weary pilots returned to refuel and rearm. It was a delicate dance of strategy and survival, and it ensured that despite the Luftwaffe's overwhelming numbers, British fighters continued to appear wherever the bombers struck. German aircrews were stunned to find resistance so persistent, often reporting disbelief at how quickly new squadrons seemed to materialize. What they did not realize was that they were witnessing the effectiveness of a revolutionary defense system, one that turned Britain's small pool of pilots into a force that seemed much larger than it was. Radar had given the RAF the gift of foresight, and foresight translated into survival. As the day wore on, attacks spread across multiple targets in southern England. Airfields at Detling, Eastchurch, and Odiham came under heavy bombardment, with hangars smashed and runways cratered by high explosive bombs. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground, fueling German hopes that fighter command might finally be on the verge of collapse. Yet even amid the destruction, ground crews worked feverishly, extinguishing fires and dragging damaged planes aside to make room for others to land. Pilots returning from combat found their bases scarred, but within hours, many of the same airfields were operational again. Civilian areas too suffered as bombs fell short of their intended targets, shattering homes and killing families who had taken shelter in cellars and basements. In London, the population waited anxiously, unsure if the capital itself would soon come under concentrated attack. Across the countryside, the sound of distant explosions became an almost constant reminder that the war had come home. Yet for every bomber that struck, another was intercepted, and many failed to deliver their payloads at all. The day was costly, but Britain endured. By evening, the Luftwaffe had launched hundreds of sorties, but the results fell short of Goering's expectations. Damage had been inflicted on several airfields, yet none of Fighter Command's critical operations centers had been destroyed. Radar stations, though hit in isolated cases, remained largely functional, continuing to provide the RAF with its vital edge. German bomber losses were heavier than anticipated, with dozens of aircraft failing to return to their bases in France. For the Luftwaffe crews, the experience of flying long missions through hostile skies under constant fighter attack was exhausting and demoralizing. Pilots who had been promised an easy victory found instead a determined and skillful enemy willing to fight to the last. The supposed Eagle Day had not clipped Britain's wings. It had only proven that the RAF could endure even the fiercest assault. In the calm of the evening, while fires still smouldered across airfields and villages, British fighters continued to land and refuel, ready to rise again at first light. And in Berlin, Hitler waited for news that never came, confirmation that Britain's air defences had been smashed beyond repair. Eagle Day ended not with triumph, but with uncertainty. For the Germans, it revealed that the conquest of Britain would not be the swift and decisive operation Goering had promised. Instead, the RAF remained bloodied but unbroken, bolstered by a system of defence that allowed it to absorb blow after blow. For the British people, Eagle Day was both terrifying and galvanizing, a reminder that the skies above them could erupt in fire at any moment, but also proof that their defenders could hold the line. The psychological impact was immense. While Germany boasted of victories in propaganda broadcasts, ordinary Britons could look skyward and see enemy bombers falling in flames. Churchill seized upon this defiance, praising the courage of the pilots he would soon immortalize as the few. Yet he also knew the struggle was far from over, and that worse trials lay ahead as the Luftwaffe adjusted its tactics. Eagle Day was not a conclusion but a beginning, the moment when the Battle of Britain shifted from scattered skirmishes to full-scale war. From this day onward, the survival of the nation would be measured not in months or weeks, but in days, sometimes in hours, sometimes in minutes. The true test of Britain's endurance had only just begun. The Feather Nosey. By mid-August 1940, the skies above southern England had become a vast dueling ground, where the fate of nations would be decided in twisting arcs of smoke and fire. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek and powerful, carved through the air with a menacing speed that often left British pilots struggling to match its climb and dive. Opposing it were the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane, two very different machines that together bore the brunt of Britain's survival. The Spitfire, with its graceful elliptical wings and razor-edge maneuverability, was the pride of fighter command, a weapon built for high-speed dogfighting against Germany's best. The Hurricane, older and less glamorous, was rugged and stable, making it perfect for tearing into bomber formations with its 8.303 Browning machine guns. German pilots were instructed to draw British fighters away from their bombers, while British commanders sought to protect those vital shipping lanes, cities and airfields that were under constant threat. The result was a deadly ballet, where every twist of a rudder and every squeeze of a trigger meant the difference between life and death. From above, the sky often appeared like a living storm cloud, filled with diving silhouettes, vapor trails, and the flashes of gunfire. Every engagement carried with it the desperation of men who knew their nations depended on their performance. It was a contest of technology, training, and nerve, an unforgiving arena where mistakes were rarely survived. For the RAF pilots, dogfights against the Bf 109 were grueling encounters. The German aircraft could outclimb and outdive most British planes, giving it the advantage in vertical maneuvers. Its fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine allowed it to continue pulling Gs during negative dives, while the carburetted Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in Spitfires and Hurricanes would momentarily cut out. This small edge often decided duels in the opening seconds. Yet British pilots adapted quickly, learning tactics such as the dive and roll or brake turns to exploit the Spitfire's superior turning radius at certain speeds. The Spitfire could roll faster and handle tighter horizontal curves, especially at medium altitudes, giving British aces the confidence to meet German fighters head-on. Hurricanes, meanwhile, lacked the agility to face a 109 on even terms, but their durability allowed them to soak up hits and keep flying. Often, the RAF sent Hurricanes to hammer the bomber streams, while Spitfires swept in to intercept the escorting fighters, a division of labor that balanced risk and reward. In the din of battle, formations often broke apart into swirling, chaotic duels where one pilot's survival depended on split-second reflexes. The outcome was rarely a draw. One man would return to base, the other would fall from the sky. The dogfights themselves were unlike anything ordinary people could imagine. At speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, pilots had only seconds to react to incoming enemies flashing out of the sun. The glare could blind them, the roar of machine guns could rattle their nerves, and the G-forces pressed their bodies hard against their seats. Many fights began with a sudden burst of tracer fire, a dazzling stream of light slicing through the air, followed by evasive dives and violent banking maneuvers. Pilots often experienced tunnel vision as their blood drained under heavy turns, making it nearly impossible to spot threats approaching from behind. It was not uncommon for men to be killed without ever seeing their attacker, ambushed from above in the unforgiving three-dimensional battlefield of the sky. For those who did see their foe, the contest was intimate and personal. Pilots described watching enemy cockpits close enough to see the faces of the men trying to kill them. The pull of the trigger was immediate, brutal, and decisive. In the space of seconds, lives ended in fireballs or spiraling wreckage crashing into the green English countryside. Tactics evolved rapidly as the summer wore on. German pilots employed the finger four formation, a flexible pattern that allowed them to cover each other's blind spots and operate in small lethal packs. This gave them an edge in coordinated attacks, especially when breaking up British formations. RAF squadrons, initially flying in the rigid Vic three-plane formation, struggled against this fluid approach. Dowding and Park eventually adapted, authorizing looser formations and wingman pairings to counter the German methods. Still, the RAF's focus remained defensive, conserve strength, protect vital targets, and wear down the Luftwaffe's resources. German fighters, forced to escort bombers across the Channel, were always pressed for time. The limited range of the Bf 109 meant that pilots had barely 20 minutes of fuel to fight over southern England before they had to turn home. This constant ticking clock shaped every engagement, forcing German commanders to break off attacks before achieving total destruction. The RAF exploited this weakness ruthlessly, knowing that if they held on, the enemy would eventually retreat. The contrast between the Spitfire and the Hurricane also played a psychological role in the skies. German pilots respected the Spitfire, often dreading the sight of its distinctive wings swooping into a fight. It was sleek, fast, and seemed to defy the laws of flight, making it the equal or even the superior of the 109 in skilled hands. The Hurricane, by contrast, was seen as slow and outdated, yet its ruggedness made it equally deadly to bombers. Pilots who flew the Hurricane often bristled at its lack of glamour, but took pride in its ability to take punishment and deliver destruction. It became the unsung workhorse of the Battle of Britain, shooting down more German aircraft than the Spitfire, though history often forgets it. Inside both cockpits, however, pilots faced the same terrifying reality: thin aluminum skins and fuel tanks just feet from their bodies, vulnerable to a single well-placed burst. Dogfights rarely offered second chances. Confidence could evaporate in a heartbeat as tracer rounds tore through wings or engines burst into flame. Victory, when achieved, often felt hollow, because every kill meant another man had been condemned to a fiery grave. The brutality of fighter combat left deep scars on the men who fought it. Many pilots described the smell of burning fuel and scorched fabric clinging to their flight suits after engagements. Some returned shaken, trembling from the adrenaline surge and the shock of seeing friends vanish in explosions. For those who shot down enemies, there was often little celebration, only a grim acknowledgement of survival. RAF squadrons suffered high turnover as young men, many barely out of school, were thrust into combat against seasoned German veterans from the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Training was short, often rushed, and mistakes were fatal. German pilots, meanwhile, flew long missions day after day, their fatigue growing even as they racked up victories. The psychological strain of constant dogfighting left both sides exhausted, haunted by the sight of parachutes drifting down, or worse, no parachute at all. Survival was measured not in years, but in weeks or even days. Each duel in the sky was not just a clash of machines, but of human endurance pushed to its breaking point. What made these duels even more extraordinary was the scale at which they occurred. On some days, more than 1,000 aircraft filled the skies in vast swirling melees. Within these massive clashes, individual dogfights unfolded like private duels in a grand tournament of death. Pilots described the chaos as overwhelming, aircraft everywhere, tracers crisscrossing the sky, and constant radio chatter that often dissolved into desperate cries. In such confusion, maintaining discipline was nearly impossible. Squadrons splintered, wingmen were lost, and pilots often found themselves utterly alone, hunted by unseen predators. A single mistake, climbing too steeply, turning too wide, or losing sight of the sun, meant instant death. Yet amid the chaos, acts of incredible skill emerged. Pilots executed rolling scissors, Immelman turns, and high-speed dives to outwit their opponents. For the men who lived, these moments of instinctive brilliance defined their survival and earned them the respect of both comrades and enemies. By the end of August 1940, the fighter duels had become the central drama of the Battle of Britain. Every confrontation in the air was a test of willpower as much as firepower. The Spitfire and Hurricane had proven themselves worthy adversaries of the Messerschmitt, though at a terrible cost in lives. The RAF strategy of using Hurricanes against bombers and Spitfires against fighters was paying dividends, ensuring that Britain remained in the fight. German losses began to mount, and the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility slowly eroded. Yet for the pilots who fought, statistics mattered little compared to the daily grind of life and death in the skies. Each duel was personal, each fight carried the weight of survival, and each returning pilot knew he might not live to see another dawn. In the clear blue skies of England, these men forged legends, even as they lived with fear and loss. The duels of fighter against fighter became the very heart of the Battle of Britain, a battle where courage and skill often mattered more than numbers. And in those duels, the few wrote a chapter of history that would never be forgotten. Long before the first great formations of German bombers appeared over the Channel, an invisible line of defence had already been laid across Britain's coasts. This defence was not made of steel, nor of concrete, but of signals pulsing through the air. Known as the Chain-Home Radar System, it was the world's first operational radar network, and it stretched like a silent sentinel from the Scottish borders to the Isle of Wight. Tall steel towers loomed against the skyline, their wiry frames bristling with aerials that crackled with unseen power. From these towers radiated pulses of energy that leapt into the sky, bouncing back from anything solid they encountered. What returned was little more than a faint echo, a flicker on a cathode ray screen, but to the trained eyes of Britain's radar operators, it was a voice whispering of incoming aircraft miles away. To the Luftwaffe, it was a mystery they scarcely comprehended, a ghostly hand that always seemed to guide British fighters to their prey. It was a weapon of foresight, and in modern warfare, foresight was everything. The chain home network had been conceived in the uneasy years before the war, when a few visionary scientists feared that air power would dominate future conflicts. Among them was Sir Robert Watson Watt, the Scottish engineer, who took the abstract idea of radio detection and turned it into practical machinery. His early experiments in the mid-1930s convinced the Air Ministry that radio waves could not only detect aircraft, but do so at vast distances. By 1938, stations were already rising along Britain's coastlines, often dismissed by locals as little more than strange power pylons. Yet beneath their lattice frames, operators in cramped huts huddled over green glowing screens, listening to the heartbeat of the skies. Unlike fighter aircraft, radar could not be destroyed in the air or exhausted in combat. It was always awake, always scanning, always ready. Without it, Britain would have been forced to rely solely on visual spotting and the limitations of human eyesight. With it, the island gained something unprecedented, the ability to see the enemy before the enemy even saw them. But radar alone was not enough. It was the human chain that made the technology come alive. The radar operators were young men and women, often in their late teens or early 20s, carefully trained to interpret the faint traces that jittered across their screens. They worked in shifts, day and night, decoding what looked like static into meaningful warnings of approaching squadrons. Every contact, every flicker, was logged and passed instantly into the sprawling network of fighter command. Alongside them stood the Observer Corps, civilian volunteers armed only with binoculars and notebooks, who stationed themselves on rooftops, hillsides and church towers across Britain. Their eyes filled the gaps. Radar could not spotting low-flying raiders, confirming altitude, or identifying aircraft types. Together, these two elements, science and human vigilance, created a layered defense that no invading air armada could hope to completely surprise. To the pilots scrambling from grass airfields, the voice on the radio was always calm and clear. Bandits, 12 miles out. Angels 15, Vector 090. Radar had given them the priceless gift of time. At the heart of this system sat the nerve center of fighter command, the filter rooms and the legendary operations room at Bentley Priory. Here intelligence from radar sites, observers and listening posts flowed in a constant stream. Women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, known simply as the WAFs, moved colored blocks across giant maps with long rakes, updating the location of enemy raids in real time. Officers watched from balconies above, calculating the numbers, weighing the risks, and deciding which squadrons to dispatch. It was a symphony of organization, a choreography of information that turned chaos into control. Without radar, such coordination would have been impossible. With it, commanders could see not only where the enemy was, but also where to conserve their limited forces. Britain did not have infinite aircraft, nor endless pilots, but radar allowed them to use what they had with ruthless precision. It was not brute strength that was keeping the island alive. It was intelligence, organization, and the invisible reach of technology. The Luftwaffe, for all its power, never fully understood the extent of what they faced. German intelligence had noted the strange towers along the coasts, but dismissed them as little more than radio communication stations. Goering himself refused to believe that radar could guide fighters so effectively, choosing instead to blame his own pilots for British interceptions. When his bombers were consistently ambushed on their way across the channel, he suspected spies, not science. In truth, the German failure to recognize radar's role was one of the gravest oversights of the war. Occasionally, German aircraft attacked the radar towers, toppling aerials or damaging equipment, but the sites were remarkably resilient. Crews repaired them in hours, and the stations returned to service before the Luftwaffe even realized they had been struck. The towers stood like unyielding giants, scarred but defiant, ensuring that Britain's eyes never closed, even under bombardment. For the pilots themselves, radar meant the difference between exhaustion and survival. Without early warning, they would have been forced to patrol the skies constantly, burning precious fuel and straining already limited machines. Instead, they could remain grounded until the enemy was confirmed, racing into the air only when needed. This system, known as scrambling, ensured that British fighters struck with maximum efficiency. Time and again, pilots would describe the experience: the sudden shout, the rush to aircraft, the engines roaring to life, and then mere minutes later, the sight of German bombers filling the horizon exactly where the ground controllers had said they would be. It seemed like magic, an uncanny sense of direction that allowed small formations of Hurricanes and Spitfires to meet vast German raids head-on. In reality, it was radar whispering its secrets into the ear of fighter command, guiding steel and courage toward the oncoming storm. Yet radar was not infallible, and its limitations shaped the tactics of the battle. The chain-home system could detect aircraft at extraordinary ranges, often over 100 miles, but it was less effective at tracking low-flying planes. That was where the observer corps proved indispensable. Filling in the gaps radar could not. Likewise, the radar could not easily determine altitude with precision, forcing commanders to rely on layered reports and estimates. Even so, the overall picture it provided was revolutionary. It allowed Britain to fight smart, focusing its scarce resources against the greatest threats and avoiding the wasteful scatter of defenses that had doomed other nations. In this sense, radar was not simply a weapon of detection, but a weapon of conservation. It turned scarcity into strength and allowed a smaller force to stand against a larger one with surprising success. In the story of the Battle of Britain, radar has often been called Britain's secret weapon, but in truth, it was never hidden. The towers were plain for all to see, standing tall against the English skies. Its secret lay not in its existence, but in its exploitation, the way Dowding and his commanders wove it into a living, breathing system of defense. When Churchill later spoke of the few who saved the many, he was speaking of the pilots, but behind them stood countless others: the operators, the observers, the map movers, and the scientists who had built this invisible shield. Every echo, every signal, every careful calculation was part of a greater whole, and as the battle raged on, it became clear that Britain's survival did not rest solely on courage or firepower. It rested too on foresight, on organization, and on the faint green glow of a radar screen in a darkened room. This was the unseen ally, and without it the skies of Britain might have fallen. By late August 1940, the Battle of Britain entered its most dangerous phase, as Hermann Göring shifted the Luftwaffe's focus to the destruction of Britain's air power at its very roots. Instead of attacking convoys or scattered targets, the German strategy now honed in on airfields, control centers, and aircraft production facilities, the very lifelines of fighter command. Across the chalk downs of southern England, from Kent to Hampshire, RAF stations became marked targets on Luftwaffe maps, their runways and hangars painted in red as priority objectives. Hinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers launched raid after raid, intent on smashing the bases that housed the precious squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Germans understood that victory would not come merely from killing pilots in the air, but by destroying the ground infrastructure that sustained them. Operations rooms, where radar plots and observer reports were translated into fighter vectors, became as valuable as factories that built aircraft wings. The logic was brutal: dismantle the system, and the RAF would collapse in weeks. For the men and women serving on these bases, the summer of 1940 now turned into a daily trial by fire. The first great storm of attacks fell upon the airfields of Kent and Sussex, where RAF squadrons closest to the Channel scrambled multiple times each day. Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch became household names not only for their daring pilots, but for the pounding they endured from German bombs. Luftwaffe formations, flying in waves of hundreds, came screaming across the coast, their bomb loads primed for hangars, control towers, and fuel depots. On the ground, crews worked frantically to refuel and rearm aircraft between sorties, often under the shadow of approaching enemy formations. Smoke columns rose from burning hangars, while craters pitted the runways, threatening to immobilize squadrons. German crews grew confident, reporting to Goering that the RAF was close to breaking, their bases shattered beyond repair. Yet despite these claims, the airfields remained operational, patched by dedicated ground staff who worked with bulldozers, shovels, and sheer determination. It was a war of endurance, measured not in single victories, but in the relentless grind of attrition. At the heart of Fighter Command's struggle was the fragile yet indispensable network of sector stations, each tasked with directing the squadrons under its command. These stations were not simply airstrips, but nerve centers, equipped with operations rooms where radar plots and observer reports were coordinated into orders. If the Luftwaffe succeeded in destroying these centers, squadrons would be blind, left to scramble without direction into a chaotic sky. Biggin Hill's ops room, buried deep beneath layers of reinforced concrete, became a repeated target of German bombing. Despite sustaining severe damage above ground, its underground heart continued to function, ensuring that pilots received their orders. The Luftwaffe, frustrated, returned again and again, determined to silence it. Across southern England, telephone lines were cut, generators destroyed, and command posts reduced to rubble. Yet, like a living organism, Fighter Command adapted, rerouting signals and improvising workarounds. Each day of survival meant that Dowding's defensive web still held, however strained. The factories that produced Hurricanes and Spitfires also came under sustained attack, as Goering sought to strangle Britain's ability to replace its losses. At Southampton, the supermarine factory, birthplace of the Spitfire, was bombed repeatedly, its workshops wrecked and production lines reduced to twisted steel. Yet even here, the resilience of British industry was remarkable. Designers and engineers salvaged equipment, relocating production to smaller, dispersed sites, hidden in barns, garages, and rural sheds. In Coventry, Birmingham, and other industrial hubs, workers labored day and night to repair machinery and replace shattered facilities. Women joined the workforce in increasing numbers, riveting fuselages and machining parts that would keep Fighter Command flying. For every Spitfire destroyed in combat, the factories struggled to send another to the front line. The Luftwaffe believed Britain's industrial heart could be crippled, but they underestimated both the adaptability of its workforce and the decentralized ingenuity of its leadership. The strain on Fighter Command during this period was immense, with squadrons forced into a relentless tempo that left little time for rest or repair. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, sometimes returning to the ground only to refuel before being scrambled again. Aircraft, battered by combat, often flew patched and imperfect, their bullet holes crudely sealed with canvas and tape. Mechanics worked through the night to make the unserviceable serviceable, snatching sleep in hangars between alerts. Airfields became scenes of organized chaos, with ambulances ferrying the wounded and funerals taking place even as the next raid approached. Losses mounted, aircraft numbers dwindled, experienced pilots grew scarcer, and exhaustion gnawed at the resolve of those still flying. Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, understood that his men were at the very limit of endurance, yet he also knew that retreat or collapse would mean disaster. He rotated squadrons where possible, pulling battered units north to rest, but the demands of battle left few spared. German optimism soared during this phase of the campaign, as Luftwaffe intelligence claimed that fighter command was on the brink of collapse. Reports suggested that airfields were irreparably damaged, that squadrons had been bled dry, and that the skies of Britain were nearly won. Goering, buoyed by these assessments, pressed his commanders to intensify the attacks, convinced that one final push would bring Britain to its knees. Yet the German evaluation was deeply flawed, built upon misread signals and overconfidence. The RAF, though battered, still fought with determination, and radar continued to provide early warning of approaching raids. Pilots may have been tired, but their spirit had not broken, and ground crews continued to restore functionality to damaged airfields at astonishing speed. What looked like collapse to the Germans was, in reality, a force stretched to its limits but still intact. This miscalculation would prove one of the most significant errors of the campaign. For the civilians who lived near these airfields, the war came home in devastating fashion. Villages near sector stations became unwilling frontline communities, bombed not for who they were, but for what lay nearby. Families huddled in shelters as bombs fell indiscriminately, their homes destroyed by the same raids aimed at the RAF. Casualties mounted not only among servicemen, but among farmers, shopkeepers, and children who lived in the shadow of the bases. Evacuation schemes moved thousands inland, while those who stayed adapted to a new reality of shattered windows and nightly terror. Civilians often rushed to assist after raids, pulling survivors from wreckage, offering tea and blankets to exhausted airmen, and volunteering in local defense units. Their contribution, though less heralded, formed part of the same struggle, their resilience reinforcing the morale of the men and women in uniform. The siege of the airfields was thus also a siege upon the communities around them. By early September, Fighter Command had reached a critical breaking point. Its squadrons reduced, its airfields scarred, and its pilots worn thin by ceaseless battle. Dowding and Park feared that one more week of such punishment might tip the balance irreversibly in Germany's favor. Yet just as the pressure reached its peak, Adolf Hitler and Goering made a fateful decision to shift strategy. Instead of continuing the assault on the airfields, the Luftwaffe would now direct its fury at London and other cities, in what became known as the Blitz. This sudden reprieve, born from German miscalculation, gave Fighter Command the breathing space it so desperately needed. Runways were repaired, squadrons rotated, and new aircraft delivered, stabilizing a defense that had been on the edge of collapse. The battle for the skies was far from over, but the RAF had endured the storm of its darkest days. The Blitz on airfields had nearly broken Britain, but it had not. By mid-August 1940, the Royal Air Force found itself locked in a test of endurance, unlike anything it had ever faced. The Luftwaffe's relentless strikes on coastal airfields, sector stations, and communication hubs were designed to break Fighter Command at its very heart. Each dawn brought the drone of enemy engines over the channel, and with them came the terrible question: could the RAF survive another day? Pilots scrambled from their bunks with only hours of rest, if that, strapping themselves into cockpits still warm from the previous sortie. Ground crews worked tirelessly, repairing aircraft under the open sky as bombs fell perilously close. Mechanics snatched minutes of sleep in hangars filled with the smell of petrol and scorched metal, while radar operators strained their eyes against flickering screens. The tempo of combat was unrelenting, with sorties stacked one after the other until exhaustion blurred the line between man and machine. At sector headquarters, phones rang ceaselessly, reports flooding in of enemy formations crossing the coast. In every corner of Fighter Command, the strain began to show. Yet the pressure only increased, as Goering demanded the Luftwaffe press harder and strike deeper. Losses mounted with alarming speed, and each tally on the chalkboards of RAF stations was a grim reminder of the stakes. Hurricanes and Spitfires returned riddled with holes, often barely clinging to the sky, only to crash land in fields or on tarmacs already scarred by craters. Some pilots walked away shaken and dazed, while others never returned at all, leaving behind empty bunks and grieving comrades. Aircraft production lines, though working at full speed, could not keep pace with the demands of battle. Factories turned out fuselages and wings around the clock, but the sheer intensity of combat ensured replacements were never enough. For Fighter Command, every plane mattered, every pilot mattered even more. The Germans believed the pressure would force Britain to collapse within weeks, but the British resilience continued to defy expectations. Each squadron that took off knew they were flying with fewer numbers than the day before, and every victory in the skies came at a punishing cost on the ground. Pilots themselves faced the sharpest edge of this crisis, enduring a brutal cycle of combat, exhaustion, and grief. On many days, a single pilot could be ordered into the air 4, 5, even 6 times. Fatigue gnawed at their reflexes, and every second delayed in spotting an enemy fighter could mean the difference between survival and death. Adrenaline kept them sharp, but when engines fell silent, the toll became impossible to ignore. Men returned to dispersal huts, with eyes sunken, uniforms soaked in sweat, and bodies trembling from exhaustion. Cigarettes became a lifeline, steadying hands still shaking from aerial duels fought at terrifying speeds. Food was often forgotten, plates left untouched, as the call to scramble once again shattered the silence. For many, sleep became elusive, broken by nightmares of flaming aircraft and dying friends. Yet when the sirens blared, they rose without hesitation, because the defense of Britain demanded nothing less. In those weeks of August, the few carried a weight that seemed impossible for mortal men. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding understood better than anyone that his command was approaching a breaking point. His system of measured, calculated defense was designed to preserve strength, but the Luftwaffe's focus on airfields threatened to overwhelm his carefully balanced strategy. Sector stations, the nerve centers of Fighter Command, were prime targets, and their destruction risked unraveling the entire defensive network. Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Tangmere were battered repeatedly, their runways cratered, control rooms reduced to rubble, and operation staff forced into makeshift shelters. Radar towers, though resilient, were also struck, threatening the precious early warning system upon which the entire defense depended. Dowding knew that the Germans had correctly identified his weak points, and there were moments when even he feared collapse was near. Yet his steady leadership never wavered. Calm in the face of crisis, he refused to panic. He trusted his system, trusted his commanders, and above all trusted the pilots who carried the fight into the skies. But privately, even he knew that the margin of survival was becoming desperately thin. Churchill, watching events unfold from Downing Street and the underground war rooms, faced his own impossible gamble. Advisers whispered that perhaps Britain should preserve its dwindling squadrons by pulling back from the south, giving ground to survive another day. But Churchill refused, knowing that yielding the skies of southern England would open the door for invasion. He insisted that every measure be taken to hold the line, no matter the cost. His daily visits to Fighter Command headquarters revealed the exhaustion etched into every face, yet he left each time with words of defiance. "We shall never surrender," he had declared to Parliament in June, and now he demanded those words be made flesh in the skies above. He understood that Britain's survival hung on a knife's edge, dependent on the courage of exhausted men and the fragile wings of their aircraft. It was not just a military struggle, but a battle of national spirit. Churchill's unyielding willpower became a rallying beacon, and in August 1940, Britain needed that beacon more than ever. For the ground crews, the crisis of August brought its own kind of torment. Mechanics worked by lamplight in bomb-shattered hangars, patching bullet holes with sheet metal and coaxing damaged engines back into life. Ammunition crews lugged belts of 303 rounds with aching arms, knowing every bullet might be the one to turn the tide in a dogfight. Fuel trucks snaked through airfields under constant threat of enemy strafing, their drivers aware that one spark could mean instant death. Medics tended to burned and broken pilots, many of whom insisted on returning to duty before they had even healed. There was no rest, no pause, only an endless cycle of repair, reload and repeat. These unsung heroes kept Fighter Command in the fight, their labor as crucial as the pilots' courage. In truth, the RAF was not only carried on the wings of the few, but also on the shoulders of thousands unseen. Every successful sortie depended on their tireless effort, and without them Fighter Command would have ground to a halt in August. The psychological strain became as dangerous as the physical one. Pilots spoke quietly among themselves of friends lost in fireballs over Kent and Sussex, their names scratched off squadron boards one by one. Fear stalked every airfield, creeping into the minds of even the bravest men. Yet they hid it behind humor, banter, and rituals, pouring drinks for fallen comrades, telling stories to chase away the darkness. Letters home were filled with reassurances they barely believed themselves, words written to spare mothers and wives from the truth. In dispersal huts, laughter was often forced, a fragile mask against the reality of death, circling ever closer. Every man knew his chances grew slimmer with each passing day. Still, they strapped in, climbed into the sky, and fought again, because to stop would mean Britain's end. The courage displayed was not the absence of fear, but the defiance of it. And in August 1940, that defiance kept the RAF alive. By the end of August, the crisis had reached a fever pitch. Fighter Command was bloodied, its squadrons worn down to the bone, and losses threatened to outpace replacements. The Luftwaffe believed victory was within its grasp, certain that the RAF could not sustain such punishment much longer. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and despair, something unbreakable remained. The system held, the pilots endured, and the factories kept sending new aircraft to the front lines. Britain had not broken, though it stood dangerously close to the edge. Churchill's gamble to resist, to hold on just a little longer, proved decisive. Unknown to many, Hitler's impatience was about to shift the Luftwaffe's focus away from Fighter Command and onto London itself. This change, born from overconfidence, would give the RAF the breathing space it so desperately needed. And so, though August 1940 nearly crushed Britain, it also set the stage for its ultimate survival. On the evening of September 7th, 1940, the skies over London darkened not with storm clouds, but with the drone of hundreds of German bombers. The Luftwaffe had shifted its aim from airfields and radar stations to the very heart of Britain's capital. For Hitler and Goering, the plan was simple. If the Royal Air Force could not be broken, then British morale must be shattered. The first wave descended over London's East End, targeting docks, warehouses, and factories that lined the Thames. Fire leapt skyward, turning the riverfront into a blazing inferno visible for miles. Civilians huddled in cellars and underground stations as roofs collapsed above them. The attack was both spectacular and terrifying, a display of overwhelming force meant to demoralize a nation. Yet instead of cowing the British public, it lit a defiant spark. That night, Britain realized it was no longer just a military campaign. It was a fight for survival in their very homes. The shift in German strategy was not born from careful calculation, but from frustration. In August, despite pounding RAF airfields, the Luftwaffe had failed to cripple fighter command. Dowding's system held, radar continued to function, and new pilots, though scarce, still joined the fight. Hitler, enraged by British bombing raids on Berlin, demanded a reprisal that would show the world German supremacy. Thus London became the bullseye. For Goering, it seemed a chance to lure the RAF into a massive, decisive battle over the capital, where the Luftwaffe could annihilate British fighters once and for all. But what the Germans failed to grasp was the resilience of Britain's command structure. By leaving the airfields in relative peace, they gave Dowding and Park precious breathing room to repair runways, replenish squadrons, and rearm aircraft. What was meant as a knockout blow to morale became, unknowingly, a lifeline to fighter command. The first great raid on London involved nearly 350 bombers, escorted by waves of Messerschmitt 109 fighters. British spotters along the coast tracked the formations, while radar stations plotted their course. The Observer Corps relayed reports of aircraft passing overhead, and soon sirens wailed across London. Families grabbed gas masks, gathered valuables, and rushed for shelter. In the streets, anti-aircraft guns roared, filling the sky with bursts of black smoke as shells exploded amid the formations. Yet for all the defences, the bombers pressed through, dropping their loads with devastating effect. Warehouses exploded, the docks blazed uncontrollably, and whole neighbourhoods vanished under rubble. The East End, home to the city's poorest, bore the brunt of the destruction, with families torn apart in an instant. Fire brigades battled heroically, pumping water into a sea of flames, but the heat was so intense that rivers boiled and steel beams twisted like straws. But the attack on September 7th was only the beginning. For 57 consecutive nights, London endured bombing raids of varying scale, sometimes involving hundreds of aircraft, sometimes only a handful probing in the dark. The city's skyline became a battlefield of firestorms and collapsing masonry. By day, Londoners tried to continue life as normally as possible, going to work, clearing debris, and reopening shops even in devastated districts. By night they descended into the London Underground, transforming train platforms into dormitories filled with blankets, mattresses, and the hum of whispered prayers. Musicians played violins to calm terrified children. Mothers nursed infants under flickering lamps, while men stood at the entrances, ready to dig survivors out of collapsed buildings above. This routine of endurance became part of London's rhythm, a testament to the spirit that Hitler had hoped to extinguish, but instead had only strengthened. Meanwhile, in the skies above London, the RAF faced its own trial by fire. Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled day after day to intercept incoming bombers, often outnumbered and exhausted, but unwilling to yield. Dogfights swirled across the city, contrails scratching patterns in the sky as machine guns rattled from both sides. Pilots had to balance aggression with caution, knowing that the fate of their homeland rested on their ability to shoot down the enemy while surviving to fight another day. Many had already lost comrades in the fierce weeks of August, and now the pressure intensified. Fatigue gnawed at them, yet the sight of their capital under attack gave them new resolve. Over London, young men in their early 20s, British, Polish, Czech, Canadian, and others, fought with a ferocity born not only of duty, but of desperation. Their task was clear: protect the city at all costs. The shift to London provided Fighter Command something it desperately needed: time to recover. Airfields in southern England, once battered by Luftwaffe bombs, were repaired and reinforced. Ground crews who had worked to exhaustion patching runways and repairing aircraft suddenly found themselves with breathing space to catch up. Factories ramped up production, pushing new Hurricanes and Spitfires into service at an accelerated pace. Training schools rushed fresh pilots to the front lines, though many had less than a dozen hours of combat practice before being thrown into the maelstrom. For Dowding and Park, the respite was invaluable, allowing them to rebuild the fighting corps that had nearly reached breaking point in late August. The irony was unmistakable. In attempting to annihilate Britain's spirit, Hitler had inadvertently restored Britain's ability to keep fighting. The morale effect of the bombing was not what Hitler anticipated. Instead of despair, Londoners adopted a grim humour and a spirit of endurance. Newspapers published stories of families who had lost everything but still declared, "We can take it." King George VI and Queen Elizabeth walked through the ruins of bombed neighbourhoods, speaking directly with survivors, their presence a powerful symbol of solidarity. Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered some of his most memorable speeches during these dark days, standing in Parliament and vowing that the British people would never surrender. "We can take it" became the defiant motto of the capital, echoing from pubs, shelters, and workplaces alike. The Blitz, as it came to be known, was not the crushing blow to morale that Hitler had envisioned. It was the forging of unity under fire. By shifting the focus of the Luftwaffe to London, Hitler committed what historians would later call his greatest strategic blunder of the Battle of Britain. For in sparing the RAF airfields and radar network from further sustained attack, he ensured that Fighter Command would survive. While London burned, Dowding's system remained intact, his squadrons grew stronger, and his pilots regained their edge. By September, the Luftwaffe had lost the initiative it once held, bogged down in a campaign of terror that could not achieve its intended result. The Blitz would continue for months, inflicting untold suffering and destruction, but it would never force Britain to its knees. Instead, it became the symbol of a nation's defiance. Hitler's decision had given Britain the one thing it needed most: time, and that time would ultimately shape the course of the entire war. On the evening of September 7th, 1940, as dusk settled over London, the rumble of approaching engines announced a terrifying new phase of the war. Hundreds of German bombers, flying in tightly organized waves, appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Behind them, a fleet of Messerschmitt 110s and 109s provided escort, determined to fend off any RAF interception. The target was not airfields or factories, but the very heart of Britain's capital, its docks, warehouses, homes, and people. As the first bombs began to fall on the East End, warehouses burst into flames, scattering sparks into the night sky like molten fireworks. The glow of fire quickly spread, illuminating the Thames with a sickening orange shimmer. For many Londoners, the war that had felt distant suddenly arrived with horrifying immediacy. The raid was the beginning of what would be known simply as the Blitz, a campaign of terror designed to break the will of a nation. The docks of the East End became the primary target in this first great attack, and the devastation was beyond imagination. Entire rows of warehouses storing food, fuel, and vital supplies erupted into infernos, casting smoke plumes that rose miles into the air. Families who had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations saw their streets obliterated in minutes. The fire brigades, brave but ill-equipped, raced from blaze to blaze, their hoses hissing futilely against the raging flames. Civilians poured buckets of water, formed human chains, and tried desperately to contain fires that seemed unquenchable. Explosions shook the ground as gas mains ignited, blasting holes in the cobblestones and spewing pillars of fire skyward. The smell of burning timber, oil, and flesh hung heavy over the city, making it impossible to escape the choking atmosphere. The raid lasted for hours, forcing thousands to flee to the underground for shelter. In those tunnels, families huddled together, listening to the thunder above, and wondering if their homes would still stand when morning came. Night after night, the Luftwaffe returned with unrelenting fury, and Londoners quickly adapted to a life lived half underground. As dusk approached, families gathered their children, blankets, and meager possessions, making their way to the nearest underground station. Platforms once designed for busy commuters now transformed into dormitories, with families laying on thin mattresses or even directly on the cold concrete. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows while volunteers distributed tea, bread, and occasional sweets to comfort frightened children. The sound of bombs reverberated through the tunnels, and dust fell from the ceiling with every nearby impact. Yet in this shared hardship, a sense of community emerged. Strangers became companions, united by the simple will to endure. Outside, wardens patrolled the streets, checking for blackout compliance, while fire watchers stood guard on rooftops, ready to extinguish incendiaries with sand and buckets of water. The city lived between two worlds, the shattering violence above and the strange claustrophobic calm below. The scale of destruction inflicted on London during the Blitz was staggering. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, their houses left as skeletal ruins with chimneys jutting like broken teeth against the sky. Iconic landmarks were scarred but endured. St. Paul's Cathedral, though surrounded by flames in one of the most famous images of the war, miraculously survived repeated attacks. The London docks became wastelands of twisted metal, sunken barges, and smouldering debris, choking the vital arteries of trade. The destruction of homes displaced tens of thousands, leaving families with nothing but the clothes they carried into the shelters. Yet the machinery of the city kept functioning. Buses resumed service the morning after raids, shopkeepers swept broken glass from storefronts and opened for business, and children still trudged to school amid ruins. This refusal to surrender normality became one of the most powerful symbols of London's endurance. Even as rubble piled higher, life carried on. The psychological strain of the Blitz was immense, testing the limits of endurance for civilians and officials alike. Families lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing if they would see the dawn after each raid. Parents tried to mask their fear for their children's sake, while children, too young to fully understand, absorbed the tension in silence. The wail of the air raid siren became the most dreaded sound in the city, sending waves of panic through streets as people rushed to shelter. Yet the silence afterward was equally unbearable, the eerie calm broken only by the distant drone of engines or the whistle of bombs falling. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, their corridors lined with beds, while morgues struggled to handle the mounting dead. Still, amid the chaos, Londoners discovered reserves of resilience. The shared suffering bound people together, creating a collective spirit that became as important as any weapon in Britain's defence. The government, recognizing the scale of the crisis, mobilized all available resources to protect and sustain the population. Air raid precautions were intensified, with wardens patrolling blackout streets and directing civilians to shelters. Civil defense organizations expanded rapidly, training thousands in first aid, firefighting, and rescue operations. Propaganda films and broadcasts encouraged calm, reminding citizens that their endurance was as crucial as the RAF's. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, ever the master of words, visited bombed-out neighborhoods, offering comfort and fiery determination in his speeches. His declaration that London can take it became a rallying cry, instilling pride amid despair. The distribution of gas masks, sandbags, and rationed food underscored the sense of shared burden. While destruction mounted, so too did the commitment of Londoners to resist. The Blitz was not merely a military assault, but a test of national willpower, and Britain's leaders ensured that civilians were both protected and inspired. Despite the devastation, the Luftwaffe's campaign failed in its ultimate goal, the breaking of British morale. Instead of surrender, Londoners responded with a grim determination to defy their attackers. Newspapers carried photographs of ordinary citizens smiling amid ruins, shop signs declared business as usual, and morale-boosting songs echoed from radios across the city. "We'll meet again, and they'll always be in England," became anthems of resilience, sung in shelters and music halls alike. Firefighters, ambulance drivers, and wardens became everyday heroes, celebrated in press and film for their courage under constant danger. Even as thousands were killed and wounded, the spirit of defiance only deepened. The Luftwaffe's bombs could shatter buildings, but they could not destroy the will of a people who refused to bow. This unbroken resolve ensured that Hitler's gamble of terror from the skies failed, becoming one of the defining moments of the entire war. By the end of 1940, London bore the scars of months of unrelenting bombing, but the city remained unbowed. The Blitz had killed more than 20,000 civilians and injured many more, leaving devastation on a scale rarely seen in modern history. Yet the resilience displayed by its people transformed the tragedy into legend. The image of St. Paul's Cathedral rising unscathed amid a sea of fire became the enduring symbol of defiance. Internationally, the Blitz inspired admiration and sympathy, strengthening Britain's ties with allies and galvanizing support for its struggle. The German strategy had backfired. Rather than crushing morale, it had fortified it, uniting the British public more strongly than ever. London's endurance during those fiery nights proved that even in the face of overwhelming destruction, courage and community could prevail. The Blitz would remain etched in history as a chapter of suffering, but also of unshakable spirit. Descre. By mid-August, the Battle of Britain had already tested nerves and machines to their limits. But August 18, 1940, would prove to be the crucible of the campaign. The day began with a deceptive calm, the skies across southern England painted with high summer clarity, a perfect backdrop for what would unfold. Both sides were acutely aware that the battle had reached a new threshold, one where the scale of fighting would decide the trajectory of the entire air war. For the Luftwaffe, it was the chance to deliver a knockout blow, crippling the RAF's airfields and defences in one decisive push. For Fighter Command, it was the grim prospect of absorbing the full weight of Germany's aerial armada. As dawn broke, German reconnaissance planes swept across the coast, mapping targets and confirming British readiness. The radar screens of the Chain Home system lit up, alerting controllers to incoming raids that hinted at the scale of the day to come. Pilots, weary from weeks of constant sorties, strapped into cockpits, knowing they would be airborne again within hours. On this day, No corner of Fighter Command's southern sector would be spared, as the Luftwaffe intended to press everywhere at once. What followed would be remembered as the most intense and punishing single day of the entire campaign. Thus, the Luftwaffe's assault began mid-morning, with bombers and fighters streaming across the channel in meticulously planned waves. Junkers 88S and Dornier 17S carried the burden of destruction, their bays loaded with bombs meant for airfields and radar installations. Escorting them were swarms of Messerschmitt 109S, their presence both protective and predatory, seeking to tie down British fighters in lethal duels. Over the skies of Kent and Sussex, the first clashes erupted with brutal suddenness, Spitfires diving from altitude to disrupt bomber formations. Hurricanes, less agile but no less vital, hurled themselves into the bombers' defensive fire, absorbing punishment while delivering bursts from their 8.303 Browning machine guns. The scale of the engagement was unprecedented, dozens of aircraft from each side locked into whirling combat, engines screaming, tracer rounds cutting the air like fiery threads. Civilians on the ground craned their necks, watching in awe and terror as contrails etched violent spirals across the sky. Communications rooms at RAF sector stations buzzed with urgent commands, their controllers directing squadrons to intercept waves that seemed endless. Already, the strain was showing on both sides as aircraft began falling in flames across fields, villages, and coastlines. Yet the battle had only just begun. The intensity of combat rose again in the early afternoon, when a second major wave bore down on the south of England. This time the Luftwaffe targeted key sector airfields such as Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Croydon, striking at the heart of Fighter Command's infrastructure. Bombs tore through hangars, blasted craters in runways, and destroyed parked aircraft, some before their pilots could even scramble. Yet for every blow inflicted, the RAF replied with ferocity, squadrons throwing themselves into the fight despite fatigue and mounting losses. Above Kenley, one of the day's fiercest duels unfolded, with Hurricanes carving into bomber formations, while Spitfires duelled Messerschmitts in lethal spirals. The Luftwaffe lost cohesion as dogfights spread across miles of airspace, formations breaking apart under relentless attack. Meanwhile, the Observer Corps relayed precise movements, ensuring that RAF squadrons could intercept even as fresh raids poured in. Ground crews labored furiously to repair runways between attacks, dragging wreckage aside to keep their bases operational. The price was staggering. Both sides saw machines reduced to twisted metal, and pilots forced to abandon aircraft in plumes of smoke. The battle was not only measured in machines lost, but in the psychological toll of unrelenting action. By mid-afternoon, August 18th, had transformed southern England into a vast battlefield in the sky. The roar of Merlin engines and Daimler-Benz 601S blended into a constant thunder that echoed across villages and towns. Bomb craters scarred the countryside, while columns of black smoke rose from burning airfields and factories. For the Luftwaffe, the mission was clear: cripple the RAF before it could recover, break its backbone in one day of annihilation. But the RAF refused to yield, pilots fighting with a desperation born not only of duty, but survival. In one sector after another, German bombers were turned back or scattered, their payloads jettisoned hastily under attack. Yet even as the RAF scored victories, the cost mounted: aircraft destroyed, irreplaceable pilots lost, and ground facilities damaged beyond immediate repair. Controllers in Fighter Command faced the terrifying arithmetic of losses, knowing every pilot shot down represented not just a man, but months of training. Civilians, too, bore witness to the savagery, with stray bombs striking homes and farms far from intended targets. The air above England had become a place of chaos where discipline and training collided with raw instinct and survival. Late in the afternoon, another wave of attacks swept in, ensuring that the day would be remembered not just for intensity, but for endurance. At Biggin Hill, one of Fighter Command's most vital airfields, bombs rained down in succession, destroying hangars and burying equipment in rubble. The control tower itself was struck, temporarily cutting communications, yet operations resumed with astonishing speed as backup systems came online. Pilots returning from combat often found no time to rest before being sent back into the air, their machines rearmed and refueled by exhausted ground crews working with frantic precision. For the Luftwaffe, losses were equally severe as British defences grew sharper with each wave, and more bombers fell to concentrated attacks. Over the Channel, the sea glittered with debris, life rafts, and oil slicks from downed aircraft. For both sides, the day had turned into a relentless test of endurance, one where human limits were pushed to the breaking point. The Luftwaffe's frustration grew as objectives slipped from their grasp, despite the enormous effort invested. The RAF, though battered, retained its cohesion, proving that it could bend without breaking. The hardest day was grinding both sides down to exhaustion. Its end as truce. As evening drew near, the fighting began to ebb, though not before final clashes erupted over the Thames estuary and southern coastlines. Squadrons returned to base with ammunition spent, fuel nearly gone, and nerves frayed to breaking. Airfields lay in smoking ruins, the ground littered with wreckage and craters that testified to the violence of the day. In villages across Kent and Surrey, civilians found fragments of aircraft in their gardens, grim reminders of the aerial inferno above. The Luftwaffe claimed significant damage, confident that their pressure was breaking the RAF's ability to resist. Yet within Fighter Command, despite devastation, there was resilience. Airfields were already being patched, and replacement aircraft were rushed forward. Most crucially, morale had not collapsed, as pilots and crews recognized that survival itself was proof of strength. Churchill's cabinet, informed of the scale of losses, grasped that the RAF had endured the worst day yet, and still stood. In Germany, the results were far less encouraging. Losses among bombers and fighters had been grievous, casting doubt on the sustainability of such operations. The day closed with no decisive victory, but with the clear sense that the Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF. The statistics of August 18th revealed the scale of the hardest day. Fighter Command lost over 60 aircraft, with dozens of pilots killed, wounded, or forced to bail out. The Luftwaffe, however, suffered even more, losing around 70 aircraft, including a heavy toll among bombers that could not be easily replaced. The numerical losses masked the deeper human tragedy. Young men from both nations, barely out of training schools, were killed in droves, their lives extinguished in the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire. For the RAF, every pilot lost was a blow, yet the system of rotation and reserve training allowed the force to retain its fighting edge. For the Luftwaffe, bomber losses struck harder, weakening their ability to sustain large-scale raids in the weeks ahead. The day demonstrated the staggering cost of attrition, proving that neither side could endure such clashes indefinitely. To Fighter Command, survival itself was a victory, for endurance was the foundation of ultimate success. For the Luftwaffe, the failure to cripple the RAF in one massive blow meant prolonging a campaign they had hoped would be short and decisive. The hardest day was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. Looking back, August 18th stands as the pivotal moment when the Battle of Britain truly hung in the balance. It was the day when both sides hurled their full weight into the skies and discovered the limits of their strength. The Luftwaffe, despite its numbers and experience, could not force the RAF to collapse, while the British proved that even at the edge of destruction, they could rally. The resilience of fighter command, its pilots, controllers, and ground crews, ensured that the battle would continue into September. For Churchill, the day was further evidence of the nation's unyielding spirit, an affirmation that Britain could and would endure. For German planners, it was a sobering lesson that air supremacy over England would not be won easily, if at all. The clash marked the turning point of the campaign, shifting momentum slowly toward Britain as the Luftwaffe bled strength with each raid. Civilians, who had watched the skies darken with warplanes, found solace in the survival of their defenders. The hardest day remains a symbol of courage under fire, where endurance triumphed over annihilation. In the annals of air warfare, it is remembered as the moment the fate of Britain's skies hung by a thread and yet held firm. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood battered, bloodied, and bracing for invasion. The Luftwaffe hammered the skies daily, and yet the threat of German troops landing on British soil loomed larger than ever. Winston Churchill understood that wars are not won by weapons alone, but by the spirit of nations. His role as Prime Minister was not only to direct policy and coordinate strategy, but to forge an unbreakable psychological shield for the British people. With his gravelly voice and powerful cadence, Churchill mastered the art of turning words into weapons. Each phrase was carefully chosen, crafted to inspire, to steel resolve, and to send a signal of unbending defiance. He knew that a wavering Britain would invite the Nazi war machine to press harder, while a steadfast Britain might cause hesitation in Berlin. The microphone became his battlefield, the airwaves his trenches, and the ears of millions his soldiers. Churchill's speeches were not mere announcements. They were calls to arms for the spirit. In the silence of bomb shelters and in the bustle of crowded factories, his voice became the sound of resistance. One of his most defining moments came on June 18, 1940, when he addressed Parliament with the speech that would echo through eternity as their finest hour. France had fallen, leaving Britain isolated against Hitler's forces, and despair seemed to stalk the island. Churchill painted the stark reality: the invasion could come at any moment, and the skies and seas would be the front lines of survival. Yet he refused to allow fear to dominate. Instead, he framed Britain's struggle as not merely a national fight, but a turning point for all civilization. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties," he declared. "So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" The words rang out like a challenge, hurled at destiny itself. He did not promise comfort or safety. He promised only the honor of standing unyielding at history's greatest test. His mastery lay in weaving grim honesty with transcendent hope. Churchill's speech became not just a statement, it was a contract with the British people. Laissez-faire. The timing of the speech was crucial, for Britain was in a lonely position that summer. The United States was not yet in the war, and Russia remained bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Britain had only itself, its dominions, and the uncertain hope that help might someday come. Churchill knew the world was listening, and his words had to travel across oceans as much as across the British Isles. Each broadcast was intended not just for miners in Wales or dockworkers in London, but for Americans, Canadians, Australians, and South Africans. He sought to show them that Britain was not a beaten nation, but one that stood as a bastion of freedom. If Britain fell, the world would follow, but if Britain held, there was still hope. Churchill wielded words as a form of global diplomacy, shaping perceptions and winning sympathy without firing a shot. His speeches were strategic as much as inspirational, working as propaganda to secure long-term survival. It was not only the RAF that held the line, it was also the echo of Churchill's voice across the Atlantic. Churchill's language was steeped in rhythm, imagery, and a near-biblical cadence. He spoke in phrases that were short, clear, and memorable, designed to be repeated by ordinary citizens. "We shall fight on the beaches," he had said just days earlier, and it became a national refrain. The power of his words was in their accessibility. Farmers, soldiers, and schoolchildren could all carry them in their minds. At the same time, he built imagery of Britain as a lonely David standing against the Goliath of Nazi power. He spoke of the abyss of a new dark age, conjuring visions of cultural annihilation and slavery. Then, in the same breath, he lit torches of hope, invoking not only survival, but the triumph of light over darkness. His speeches were theatre, scripture, and military order all in one. With pauses, growls, and emphasis, Churchill controlled not just meaning but emotion itself. He turned fear into courage, grief into resilience, and doubt into determination. Radio was Churchill's greatest ally, carrying his voice into living rooms, bunkers, and factory halls. In an age before television dominated, the intimacy of the spoken word was unmatched. Families gathered around wireless sets, as though in a sacred ritual, waiting for the familiar tones of the Prime Minister. The nation did not see his cigar or bulldog face. They felt his presence through the vibration of syllables and the silence between them. To a nation under attack, this intimacy mattered deeply. It reassured them that their leader was not distant in Whitehall, but standing shoulder to shoulder with them in their ordeal. Churchill harnessed modern media as effectively as any general commanded divisions. Where Hitler used fiery rallies and Nazi spectacles, Churchill used the calm, resonant confidence of his broadcasts. It was a clash not just of armies, but of voices. And in this war of voices, Churchill gave Britain an indomitable spirit that bombs alone could not shatter. But Churchill's speeches were not only for morale. They were carefully aimed at foreign allies, particularly the United States. Franklin Roosevelt listened closely, understanding that Britain's survival depended on American aid. Churchill used rhetoric to underline the moral stakes, portraying the war as a struggle for humanity's very soul. His words made it impossible for Americans to dismiss Britain's plight as a European quarrel. Instead, they began to see it as a fight for democracy against tyranny. Every phrase about the new world stepping forth to rescue the old was designed to awaken sympathy in Washington. While the United States clung to neutrality, public opinion shifted steadily under the force of Churchill's narrative. The Lend-Lease program, which later sent ships, planes, and supplies, owed much to the Prime Minister's speeches. He turned diplomacy into poetry and secured lifelines for his island nation. Churchill's mastery of words created bridges where fleets could not sail. At home, the propaganda war was waged on many fronts, but Churchill's speeches formed its backbone. Newspapers reprinted his words, posters echoed his slogans, and newsreels reinforced his message. Even in bomb shelters, people would whisper lines from his speeches as if they were prayers. This repetition made his phrases part of Britain's cultural DNA, in contrast to Nazi propaganda, which sought to terrify and dominate. British propaganda aimed to unify and endure. Churchill insisted on honesty about losses, never sugarcoating the dangers, because he believed courage was built from truth. His candor earned him trust, and his imagery gave the people strength to bear even the darkest nights. In this sense, his speeches became more than propaganda. They were lifelines of truth, wrapped in inspiration. His words fortified not only the will to fight, but the will to believe in ultimate victory. For a nation under siege, that belief was everything. As the Battle of Britain raged and bombs fell nightly, Churchill's speeches remained the drumbeat of endurance. He never let despair take the final word, always concluding with a vision of triumph. When people thought of surrender, they remembered his vow that Britain would never give in. When families wept over losses, they recalled his promise that sacrifice today would echo as glory tomorrow. In the grand theatre of World War II, Churchill was both actor and playwright, shaping Britain's role with syllables that became symbols. He carved defiance into the consciousness of his people and etched it across the airwaves of the free world. Even today, the words "their finest hour" summon images of fighter pilots, bombed cities, and a nation standing unbroken. Churchill understood that battles are remembered not only in casualty lists, but in the phrases that outlive them. His speeches were monuments built in sound, eternal in memory, and unshakable in impact. They were the weapon that turned endurance into victory. Do you want me to continue in this same style for Chapter 17, September 15th, the decisive day, where the RAF proves its strength in the skies? You said, next chapter. Chapter 17, German Miscalculations. Cracks in the Luftwaffe. Logistical errors. Fatigue, misjudging radar, and Goering's disastrous command decisions. 8 detailed paragraphs, with 10 sentences, each per paragraph fixed. Each will read like a professionally written Netflix-style narration script for your documentary, with minute details to keep the viewers engaged, for reducing retention, with flowing sentences, historical depth, and descriptive immersion. Extremely detailed paragraphs, explaining everything in very detail. Script is fully expanded. No repetition, no squeezing or summarizing. ChatGPT said, here's EPS Chapter 17. German Miscalculations. Cracks in the Luftwaffe, written as you requested. Chapter 17. German Miscalculations. Cracks in the Luftwaffe. By late summer 1940, the Luftwaffe found itself straining under pressures that its high command had neither predicted nor adequately prepared for. When the campaign began, Goering and his staff were confident that Britain could be subdued in a matter of weeks, dismissing the RAF as an inferior opponent clinging to outdated machines. Yet as August wore on, German bombers and fighters returned from missions battered, often with heavy losses, and the quick victory promised by Berlin had evaporated. Logistical cracks began to spread, with overextended supply lines struggling to provide sufficient fuel, spare parts, and ammunition to squadrons operating from hastily prepared French airfields. Aircraft maintenance suffered under the constant tempo, with mechanics working frantically but unable to keep pace with attrition. Pilots flew multiple missions in a single day, their fatigue compounded by the psychological toll of relentless dogfighting. Luftwaffe losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained, leaving units increasingly under strength. What was envisioned as a swift knockout blow became a grinding war of endurance for which Germany was unprepared. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility began to unravel with every failed raid, and still Goering refused to accept that his strategy was faltering. Central to the Luftwaffe's failure was the gross misjudgment of radar, Britain's invisible yet decisive shield. Goering and his planners dismissed the early warning system as little more than an experimental toy, believing German bombers could easily destroy the tall masts that dotted the English coast. Raids were indeed launched against radar stations in the first weeks, but the attacks were poorly coordinated and swiftly repaired by British crews working with astonishing speed. To German eyes it seemed pointless to waste bombs on steel towers that appeared indestructible. What Goering never grasped was that radar gave Britain something he could never counter: time. The chain home network allowed RAF controllers to track enemy formations long before they reached the coast, vectoring fighters with precision to intercept. This technological edge multiplied the strength of Britain's limited forces, ensuring the Luftwaffe was nearly always met by defenders. The failure to recognize radar's significance was one of the gravest miscalculations of the campaign. By ignoring this invisible weapon, Goering effectively allowed the RAF to fight on equal terms, and in a battle of endurance, time was the ally Britain desperately needed. Compounding these errors was the Luftwaffe's flawed doctrine, built for blitzkrieg but ill-suited for a prolonged aerial campaign. The German air arm had been designed to support fast-moving ground offensives, overwhelming opponents with short, sharp strikes. It lacked the heavy four-engine bombers needed to cripple enemy industry or sustain a strategic campaign against a resilient opponent. Instead, medium bombers like the Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Do 17 were pressed into roles for which they were never designed. They carried limited payloads and were highly vulnerable without fighter escort, especially when forced to penetrate deep into British airspace. The escort fighters themselves, the Messerschmitt Bf 109S, suffered from short operational ranges, leaving bombers exposed once they pushed beyond southern England. German planners had never anticipated such constraints, assuming Britain would collapse quickly under sustained pressure. Yet, as the campaign dragged on, the mismatch between Luftwaffe capabilities and its strategic objectives became increasingly obvious. The very structure of the German Air Force was ill-prepared for the battle it had been ordered to fight. The strain of constant operations took its heaviest toll on the men themselves, as fatigue and dwindling morale began to corrode the fighting edge of the Luftwaffe. German pilots flew up to 3 or 4 sorties a day, enduring nerve-shattering combat against determined RAF opponents. Rest between missions was brief, meals were rushed, and nights offered little reprieve as they prepared for the next dawn's battle. Unlike the British, who fought close to home, German aircrews faced long flights over the Channel, increasing both physical and mechanical strain. The losses were staggering. Elite fighter units that had dominated in France were now bleeding experienced aces at an unsustainable rate. Replacements, often hastily trained, could not match the skill of the veterans they replaced, leading to a steady decline in overall effectiveness. For many pilots, the constant grind-bred disillusionment, with some realizing the promised victory was slipping away. Letters sent home hinted at growing doubts, though such sentiments were never spoken openly in Goering's presence. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility dimmed with each passing week. Exhaustion was no longer an inconvenience, it was a decisive factor. Meanwhile, Goering himself proved to be one of the Luftwaffe's greatest liabilities. Arrogant, impulsive, and increasingly detached from the realities of air warfare, he often issued orders that defied logic. He shifted strategies erratically, first focusing on destroying RAF fighters, then suddenly diverting attacks to airfields, and later ordering massive raids on London. These constant changes left squadrons uncertain of their objectives, reducing the coherence of the overall campaign. Goering's obsession with prestige and spectacle over practical results only deepened the cracks in German planning. He believed morale could be broken by terror raids rather than systematic destruction of Britain's defensive infrastructure. His disdain for intelligence reports, which warned of British resilience, blinded him to the growing strength of fighter command. For pilots risking their lives daily, Goering's flamboyant speeches and hollow promises provided little comfort. His failure to craft a consistent strategy ultimately squandered whatever advantages the Luftwaffe initially possessed, and within the ranks, whispered criticisms of his leadership became harder to silence. Another crippling miscalculation lay in German intelligence, which consistently underestimated the RAF's true strength. Reports to Berlin claimed that British squadrons were on the brink of collapse, their losses unsustainable, and their morale broken. In reality, thanks to the efficient rotation of pilots and the miracle of rapid aircraft production, fighter command remained stubbornly resilient. British factories, protected from destruction, churned out Spitfires and Hurricanes at remarkable speed, ensuring frontline squadrons were rarely starved of machines. Replacement pilots, though often inexperienced, were integrated carefully under Dowding's system, ensuring the RAF could sustain the fight. Yet Goering and his staff clung to the belief that one more massive push would finally break their enemy. This misjudgment drove the Luftwaffe deeper into a campaign it was ill-prepared to win, throwing men and machines into a grinder that only benefited Britain. By failing to see reality, German command prolonged the battle and guaranteed mounting losses. Intelligence failures, combined with wishful thinking, proved fatal to Hitler's hopes for conquest. The logistical backbone of the Luftwaffe also began to buckle under the demands of the campaign. Operating from captured airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German units faced enormous challenges in sustaining high sortie rates. Fuel had to be shipped over long distances, spare parts were scarce, and maintenance crews were stretched beyond endurance. Unlike the RAF, which operated close to its bases and repair depots, the Luftwaffe had to contend with fragile supply chains, vulnerable to disruption. The lack of proper infrastructure on the continent meant aircraft were often serviced in makeshift conditions, leading to delays and mechanical failures. Even the smallest disruption could ground entire squadrons, reducing operational effectiveness. These problems multiplied as the tempo of battle increased, with each day of combat eroding the Luftwaffe's ability to maintain pressure. The dream of overwhelming Britain through sheer numbers collapsed as logistics faltered. In modern warfare, machines were only as effective as the system that sustained them. For the Luftwaffe, that system was stretched to breaking. By September 1940, the combined weight of these miscalculations, flawed strategy, underestimation of radar, poor intelligence, logistical weakness, and Goering's erratic leadership was dragging the Luftwaffe toward inevitable failure. What began as Hitler's confident gamble to knock Britain out of the war had become a war of attrition that Germany could not sustain. Each raid that failed to crush the RAF only strengthened British resolve, while every lost bomber or fighter weakened German capacity for the future. The myth of German air supremacy, so carefully cultivated during earlier campaigns, lay shattered over the fields of southern England. Pilots once hailed as conquering heroes now faced the grim reality of mounting losses and dwindling hope. For the first time in the war, Hitler's forces had met an opponent they could not bend to their will. The Battle of Britain was no longer just a clash of machines, it was a test of endurance, willpower, and leadership. And in that test, the Luftwaffe's cracks had become chasms. Germany's defeat was not the result of a single blow, but of countless small failures compounding into disaster. The seeds of their downfall had been sown by their own miscalculations. By September 1940, the skies over Britain had become a battleground where exhaustion weighed as heavily as bombs. The Luftwaffe, once confident of overwhelming fighter command, began to falter under the strain of sustained losses and stretched supply lines. German fighter pilots, who had been flying multiple sorties a day since July, were now running on the edge of physical and mental collapse. Aircraft production in Germany could not match the attritional pace of combat, leaving squadrons under strength and often flying machines patched together hastily. Meanwhile, Britain's aircraft factories, pushed to the limit under the Ministry of Aircraft Production, were turning out more fighters than the Luftwaffe was destroying. The psychological balance of the campaign began to shift as British pilots, though bloodied, sensed that the enemy was no longer invincible. Each interception, each squadron scrambled from their bases, became a test of endurance that the RAF increasingly passed. For the German High Command, optimism faded as the reality of Britain's resilience became undeniable. Hitler's vision of invasion across the Channel started to look more like a fading mirage than an imminent conquest. And in those crucial September weeks, the tide of the battle turned irreversibly. The German strategy, intended to crush the RAF and open the path for Operation Sea Lion, founded on flawed assumptions. Goering and his planners had underestimated both the strength of Britain's fighter defences and the efficiency of radar in directing intercepts. The Luftwaffe had counted on quick victories, yet the weeks dragged into months with mounting casualties. Pilots complained of fatigue and dwindling morale, while replacement crews arriving at the front were often undertrained compared to their British counterparts. Even the vaunted Beef 109, though superior in some respects to the Spitfire, faced operational limits, particularly its short range over southern England. German bombers, increasingly forced to operate without reliable fighter cover, suffered catastrophic losses in daylight raids. The tactical picture darkened for Germany with each failed attempt to dominate the skies. As Britain's population endured the bombings with defiance, the Luftwaffe's credibility as an unstoppable force crumbled. Hitler grew impatient, but impatience could not substitute for air superiority. Without that, any invasion across the Channel was doomed before it began. For Britain, September offered no respite from danger, but it revealed the resilience of fighter command in its most decisive form. Airfields were battered, pilots were stretched thin, but the system held together under Dowding's leadership. The integrated defense network, radar, observer posts, and rapid response squadrons functioned like clockwork, often allowing Britain to put fighters exactly where they were needed most. By this stage of the battle, fighter command's strength in aircraft had stabilized, with production outpacing losses, giving it a crucial edge in sustainability. Pilots who had survived the worst of August were now hardened veterans, sharper in the cockpit, and more adept at anticipating German tactics. Public confidence, shaken in the early weeks, grew stronger with each raid repelled. Newspapers trumpeted the victories, and Churchill's rhetoric painted the fighter boys as the shield of the nation. Every successful interception became a symbol of Britain's refusal to bow to Hitler's might. For ordinary citizens, looking skyward at contrails and dogfights, it was clear the RAF was not breaking but holding. That realization became the backbone of a nation's morale. The Luftwaffe's withdrawal from focused assaults on airfields and radar sites to the bombing of London inadvertently gave fighter command breathing room. While London burned under the Blitz, the squadrons that had been pushed to breaking point in August found time to rest, repair, and replenish. Aircraft losses that had once threatened to cripple entire sectors could now be recovered through reinforced production. Pilots who had been flying to the edge of exhaustion were rotated, allowing new blood to enter the fight alongside seasoned veterans. This shift in German strategy, intended to terrorize Britain into submission, had the opposite effect militarily. Fighter command regained its footing and emerged from September in stronger condition than when it entered. The Germans had failed to anticipate the resilience of both the RAF system and the British people. What Goering framed as a tactical redirection was, in reality, a strategic blunder that gave Britain the time it desperately needed. By October, the Luftwaffe no longer held the initiative, The skies were contested, but they were no longer controlled by Germany. The cost of the campaign was staggering on both sides, but it was Germany that could least afford the attrition. By mid-October, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,700 aircraft, along with many of its best trained crews. Bomber groups that had begun the campaign with confidence now flew with reduced formations and heightened fear of British fighters. Replacement crews, rushed into service, lacked the skill of the men they replaced, further eroding combat effectiveness. By contrast, Britain, though losing over 900 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, had managed to sustain its fighting core. The aircraft industry, bolstered by round-the-clock production, kept squadrons supplied. Civil defense and recovery crews cleared airfields and rebuilt infrastructure with relentless speed. The balance of attrition, so crucial in a long campaign, favored Britain. Each passing week reduced Germany's options for victory, and with the Channel winds turning colder, the window for invasion quietly closed. Hitler's decision to postpone Operation Sea Lion in mid-September marked the symbolic collapse of the invasion dream. Though the official line framed it as a delay, those within the German High Command understood that it was abandonment. Without command of the skies, any amphibious landing across the Channel would be a suicide mission. German naval leaders had already expressed grave doubts about their capacity to protect vulnerable transport barges against the Royal Navy. Now, with the Luftwaffe unable to neutralize the RAF, those doubts became insurmountable. Hitler turned his attention toward the east, already envisioning his grand campaign against the Soviet Union. Yet the shadow of failure over Britain hung heavy, a reminder that the Reich was not invincible. The British Isles had stood as a bastion of resistance, and the myth of Nazi inevitability was cracked. What began as a battle for air supremacy had become a symbolic struggle for the free world, and in that struggle, Britain had emerged bloodied but unbroken. For the people of Britain, victory in the skies did not mean safety from bombs, but it meant survival as a nation. The nightly raids continued, fires still raged in London and other cities, but the imminent threat of invasion receded. The knowledge that the RAF had endured gave ordinary citizens the strength to endure as well. Children emerged from shelters, shopkeepers reopened businesses, and communities rebuilt even under constant bombardment. Churchill and his ministers capitalized on this spirit, framing Britain as the last fortress of freedom standing against tyranny. Across the Atlantic, American observers reported on Britain's defiance, swaying public opinion toward eventual support. Propaganda films showed Spitfires soaring against bombers, embodying resilience that inspired allies and intimidated foes. Britain's survival sent shockwaves through occupied Europe, proving that resistance was not futile. The myth of German invulnerability was shattered in the skies above England, and in that shattering hope flickered across the continent. By the end of October 1940, the Battle of Britain had entered history as the first major defeat of Hitler's war machine. The Luftwaffe, unable to secure air superiority, had been forced to scale back its daylight raids and shift to night bombings, the Blitz that would drag on through the winter. Yet the decisive campaign, the one that would determine Britain's fate, was over. Fighter Command stood battered but alive, its survival ensuring that the British Isles remained unconquered. Churchill declared with pride that never had so many owed so much to so few, and those words became immortal. The RAF's victory was not only military, but moral, proving that Hitler could be resisted and defeated. Britain became the cornerstone of Allied strategy, a staging ground for the eventual liberation of Europe. The young men who fought in the skies had altered the course of history with their courage. And the outcome of 1940 ensured that the war would not be won in a single swift stroke by Germany, but in a long grinding struggle that Britain was now destined to endure and to outlast. As the Battle of Britain drew to a close, the statistics etched themselves into the fabric of history, not merely as numbers but as symbols of immense sacrifice. More than 500 RAF pilots were killed in action, most of them in their early 20s, and some barely out of school. These were young men who had just begun to live, yet fate thrust them into the cockpit to defend their nation. Their photographs, now faded with time, once showed eager smiles, school blazers, and the promise of futures that never arrived. Families across Britain mourned in silence, writing letters to the Air Ministry that often returned with condolences and the dreaded phrase, "missing in action." The airfields became both cemeteries of wreckage and living monuments to courage, with burnt-out aircraft scattered across grassy runways. Graves filled up in small English churchyards, where villagers stood side by side with grieving parents, offering flowers and quiet prayers. Each pilot's name became part of an immortal roll of honor, their lives forever entwined with the nation's survival. To the people of Britain, these men were not strangers but guardians who had held the line when the world teetered on the edge. Their sacrifice was the price of freedom, a cost felt in every household and echoed in every empty chair at the dinner table. On the German side, the cost was equally severe, though often buried beneath propaganda and silence. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 2,000 aircraft during the campaign, each one representing not only advanced machinery, but also trained men who would never return. German aircrew too were young, many just 19 or 20, torn from their homes in Bavaria, Saxony, or the Rhineland, and hurled into skies over England. Survivors who were captured often found themselves treated with surprising decency, offered tea by villagers before being handed to guards. For those who perished, the Channel and English fields became their unmarked graves, thousands of miles away from their families. German mothers and fathers, much like their British counterparts, received official notices, yet under Hitler's regime, grief had to be silent and unspoken. The Luftwaffe's promise of quick victory instead delivered a harvest of widows, fatherless children, and empty classrooms across Germany. Goering's boast that no British bomb would ever fall on German soil proved tragically hollow when his air force was drained of its finest men. For Germany, the campaign was not only a military failure, but a human catastrophe that crippled its long-term war effort. The price of arrogance and miscalculation was measured in coffins, burnt steel, and broken families. Beyond the airmen, the British civilian population bore the brunt of the Luftwaffe's fury in a way that redefined modern warfare. The Blitz left tens of thousands dead, their lives extinguished in the firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods of London, Coventry, and Liverpool. Children were pulled from rubble, some alive, others gone, their toys buried under bricks and twisted beams. Entire streets vanished overnight, with survivors huddled in the underground as bombs whistled above. Families lived in perpetual fear, listening for the siren's wail that split the night and sent them scrambling into shelters. Fire brigades, stretched thin, fought flames that lit the sky with a hellish glow visible for miles. Civilian volunteers, from air raid wardens to ambulance drivers, risked their lives to save strangers, often dying in the very streets they patrolled. The stoic face of Britain, the so-called Blitz spirit, was born out of necessity, forged in basements and tunnels, and immortalized in shared suffering. For ordinary people, survival was not an act of choice, but of endurance, a nightly battle against steel and fire. Their sacrifice, though unarmed, was no less heroic, for it was their resilience that denied Hitler the victory he sought. Factories and industrial workers also paid their share of the price, though their names rarely made headlines. Day and night, men and women labored in aircraft plants, often under the shadow of German bombing raids. These workers assembled the Hurricanes and Spitfires that became the backbone of fighter command, their hands blistered and backs aching from endless shifts. Many of them were women, part of the munitionettes, who filled roles once reserved for men now at the front. With scarves tied around their heads and oil smudged across their faces, they built the machines that kept Britain's skies defended. Factories like Supermarine in Southampton and Hawker in Kingston were prime Luftwaffe targets, bombed repeatedly in an attempt to halt production. Workers often returned the very next morning, stepping over shattered glass and twisted metal to resume their tasks. For them, the war was fought not with rifles, but with rivets and spanners, their battleground, the assembly line. Some lost their lives when bombs struck the factories themselves, dying among the machines they served. Their quiet sacrifices ensured that pilots were never left without the weapons they needed to fight. The cost was also psychological. Borne heavily by the surviving pilots of fighter command, those who lived through countless sorties carried invisible scars that haunted them long after the war. They watched close friends vanish in fireballs or parachute helplessly into the sea, powerless to intervene. Exhaustion gnawed at them, for sleep was rare, and adrenaline often replaced rest. Many relied on alcohol or sheer willpower to keep flying, even as nerves frayed and hands shook from fatigue. Commanders recognized the strain, but had little choice. Every man was needed, and replacements were too few. Some pilots broke under the pressure, their minds unable to reconcile constant danger with fleeting youth. Yet those who endured spoke later of guilt that they had survived when others had not. The mental toll, though invisible at the time, lingered like a shadow over their post-war lives. Victory was real, but it came wrapped in trauma, a price Britain would quietly pay for decades. Across Britain, the civilian cost extended beyond death and destruction to the fracturing of daily life. Families were separated by the evacuation of children to the countryside, often to live with strangers. Mothers wrote letters that sometimes never reached their sons and daughters, their voices lost in the chaos of war. Cities once vibrant with laughter and commerce became scarred landscapes of boarded windows, ration lines, and bombed ruins. Rationing itself was a burden. Meat, sugar, and even soap carefully measured out, altering lives in ways both large and small. Holidays disappeared, weddings were rushed before deployments, and funerals became frequent yet subdued affairs. For children, war robbed innocence, replacing it with nights in shelters and the sound of distant gunfire. For the elderly, memories of the First World War resurfaced, layered with new terrors. The emotional burden fell across generations, uniting Britain in shared suffering, but also draining its people of countless dreams. The war was fought in the skies, but its wounds were etched into the fabric of ordinary homes. Every sacrifice added weight to the ledger of survival. Material destruction compounded the human toll, altering the very landscape of Britain. London, once a sprawling capital of grandeur, became scarred with bomb craters, collapsed buildings, and streets reduced to rubble. Coventry's medieval cathedral lay in ruins, a haunting symbol of cultural loss and human devastation. Factories, docks, and railways, the arteries of the nation, were repeatedly hammered, forcing constant repair under impossible conditions. Thousands were left homeless, wandering through ruins with only the clothes on their backs and the hope of finding loved ones. Emergency housing, often hastily constructed, became the new reality for many, while others lived indefinitely in shelters. The economy groaned under the strain, Yet the destruction did not break Britain's will, it hardened it. Even as buildings crumbled, communities bound together, drawing strength from collective endurance. Yet the scars were permanent, leaving entire neighborhoods changed beyond recognition. The price of survival was not only counted in lives lost, but in the erasure of places, histories, and ways of life. Britain endured, but it did not emerge unscarred. In the final reckoning, the Battle of Britain was both a triumph and a tragedy, its victory inseparable from the sacrifices it demanded. The young pilots, immortalized as the few, stood at the center of the story, their courage legendary, their loss immeasurable. Civilians bore their share, proving that war was no longer confined to distant fronts, but had invaded the hearth and home. Germany, too, paid dearly, its Luftwaffe weakened, its soldiers buried far from home, and its aura of invincibility shattered. For both nations, the battle was not a fleeting episode, but a defining moment in human cost. Freedom had been preserved, but at the price of blood, grief, and shattered lives. The ruins of Coventry, the graves of Kent, and the faces of orphans stood as silent reminders of that cost. Churchill's words resonated with truth. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The story of the Battle of Britain was thus not only about strategy and victory, but about sacrifice and survival. And in that sacrifice lay the true measure of Britain's finest hour. The Battle of Britain was more than just a clash of aircraft. It was the first decisive battle fought entirely in the air, and its legacy reached far beyond the summer skies of 1940. For Britain, it was not simply about repelling an enemy, but about surviving as a free nation in the face of Hitler's seemingly unstoppable war machine. Until that point, Nazi Germany had swept through Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France with terrifying speed and brutal efficiency. The Luftwaffe appeared invincible, and the world held its breath, expecting Britain to collapse like so many others. Yet, in this crucible of fire, Britain stood firm, and the battle etched itself into history as the first major defeat suffered by Hitler's forces. This symbolic crack in German dominance signaled to the world that Nazi power was not limitless. The survival of Britain meant that Hitler's dream of European domination would never be complete. More importantly, it marked a turning point where hope flickered once again across the globe. Besit was hissested as Taysirk today from that sea. Strategically, the Battle of Britain prevented Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of the British Isles, from ever materializing. Without air superiority, the German Navy could not hope to protect its troop transports against the Royal Navy, which remained the strongest fleet in Europe. By holding the line in the skies, the RAF ensured that Britain remained a base of operations for the Allied war effort. This survival was critical when the time came to launch the D-Day landings in 1944, as Britain provided the staging ground for the liberation of Europe. Churchill himself described the outcome of the battle as the shield that kept the island nation safe until the Allies could strike back. Without that shield, the entire trajectory of the war would have shifted, perhaps irreversibly. The world may never have seen an Allied invasion of France, and Hitler could have secured domination across the continent. The victory ensured that Britain remained a thorn in the side of the Reich for the rest of the war. The human element of the battle carved an indelible mark on Britain's cultural memory. The few, as Churchill so famously called them, were remembered not just as pilots, but as symbols of courage, sacrifice, and determination. They were young men, often barely out of school, who carried the weight of their nation's survival on their shoulders. Many of them died, but their sacrifice became immortalized in memorials, literature, and collective remembrance. Every year after the war, ceremonies commemorated their defense of the realm, keeping alive the spirit of resistance against tyranny. For ordinary civilians, the story of the few offered a narrative of hope in a time of despair. Even decades later, their example continued to inspire new generations, serving as a reminder that freedom often depends on the sacrifices of the brave. In this sense, the battle was not only a military turning point, but also a moral one, giving Britain a heroic myth to cling to during its darkest hour. Internationally, the legacy of the Battle of Britain reshaped perceptions of the war. In the United States, where isolationist sentiment still lingered in 1940, Britain's defiance captured the imagination of the public. Newsreels showing Londoners enduring the Blitz and young pilots fighting against overwhelming odds stirred sympathy and admiration. American leaders, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt, saw in Britain's survival a reason to increase material aid, paving the way for the Lend-Lease program. Without this crucial support, Britain's continued fight would have been far more precarious. Furthermore, the battle demonstrated that Hitler was not invincible, giving encouragement to occupied nations who had seen their countries overrun by German troops. From Paris to Warsaw, whispers of resistance grew louder as news spread that the Reich had suffered its first setback. The psychological effect of this defeat was immense, planting seeds of doubt within German ranks, while igniting determination among Hitler's enemies. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the spearhead of German conquest, emerged from the battle weakened and tarnished. Though it remained a formidable force, its aura of invincibility was shattered. The logistical errors, leadership failures, and heavy losses suffered during the battle exposed cracks in Göring's command and Hitler's strategy. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,700 aircraft, many of them irreplaceable, while the RAF maintained just enough strength to fight another day. Pilots and crews lost in the battle could not be easily replaced, and the strain on Germany's resources began to show. The Germans had underestimated the British radar network, the resilience of fighter command, and the determination of a people under siege. These miscalculations haunted Germany for the rest of the war, as the Luftwaffe was never again able to mount a campaign of such scale and intensity against Britain. It was a pivotal weakening of Germany's air power, with consequences that stretched across every subsequent theatre of the conflict. For Britain itself, the battle reinforced a sense of unity and resilience that carried it through the war. Civilians who had endured the Blitz emerged with a hardened determination to continue resisting. The shared experience of blackouts, air raid sirens, and sheltering in the underground created a collective identity of endurance. Propaganda films, radio broadcasts, and Churchill's stirring speeches amplified this spirit, binding together a population that had once seemed fractured along class lines. The victory in the skies became a cornerstone of national pride, a rallying cry that would echo through subsequent hardships. It was not simply about survival, but about defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. That defiance became a defining characteristic of Britain's wartime identity, shaping how the nation saw itself during the conflict, and how it would remember the war for generations to come. In military history, the Battle of Britain stands as a textbook example of how technology, strategy, and morale can converge to alter the course of war. Radar, an unproven innovation in 1940, proved decisive in giving fighter command the ability to anticipate and counter German raids. The integrated system of command and control pioneered by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding provided a model for future air defense networks. The tactical flexibility of pilots, who learned to adapt to German formations and tactics, highlighted the importance of training and discipline over sheer numbers. Equally significant was the morale of both pilots and civilians, who refused to be broken despite relentless bombing. Military historians would later study the battle as an illustration of how a smaller force, when properly organized and determined, could repel a larger, seemingly unstoppable enemy. In this sense, the battle left behind lessons that extended far beyond the Second World War. Ultimately, the legacy of the Battle of Britain lies in the simple fact that Britain endured by standing firm. It kept alive the hope of liberation for Europe and maintained a base from which the Allies could eventually strike back. It marked the moment when Hitler's advance was halted for the first time, forcing him to turn his gaze eastward toward the Soviet Union. This strategic pivot would eventually stretch German resources to the breaking point, contributing to the Reich's downfall. For Britain, the victory became a source of lasting pride, enshrined in memory through monuments, museums, and the annual Battle of Britain Day. For the world, it symbolized the resilience of democracy against dictatorship, the triumph of freedom over tyranny, and the power of a determined people to resist domination. Long after the guns fell silent, the echoes of the battle continued to resound, reminding future generations of the price of liberty and the courage required to defend it.